Welcome, everyone, to the Wizard of Radical Self-Respect. My name's Jared Mello, and I'm the Shepherd of Black Sheep. Yesterday, took the day off because I wasn't feeling too good. I'm still not 100% today, but I'm good enough to at least be talking to you all, which is good. And today now, what we have is some new information about the Nick Reiner case. The last several streams, I've gone over the Tepe case and Michael McKee. So as a change of pace here, we'll go over this case today, the Nick Reiner case. And then there's also an au pair case that I might go over in the future if there's interest in me going over that. So in this stream, we're going to go over a video from Popcorn Planet. There's a couple others from Tony Bruschi. And there'll even be one from Hidden True Crime where a psychologist reacts. So we'll see how people take to all that. Jimmy, Ty Cena, welcome.
Some fascinating updates in the Nick Reiner case. Apparently, Nick was in a mental health conservatorship in 2020. Also, Nick Reiner's previous attorney, Alan Jackson, is still on a press tour, and the Reiner family is livid about it.
And so here's the other thing about this, right? So this is the first we've heard of this conservatorship that Nick Reiner was in 2020. And as far as we know, a mental health conservatorship. But let's see what they say about it.
Welcome to Popcorn Planet. I am Andy Signor. We got some updates for you regarding the Nick Reiner case. And I want to start here with this conservatorship news. It's been making the rounds. He was in a mental health conservatorship in 2020 for a year and then was released. We got to talk about this. Now, when I hear conservatorship, I immediately think Britney Spears and I immediately get triggered. Red flags go off, but this was different. Britney Spears' conservatorship was really focused on keeping her profitable, keeping her working. Basically, she was controlled while functional. Nick Reiner apparently wasn't functional, and that's why he was put on this 1-year conservatorship. Now, this was confirmed through multiple sources, the New York Times, and a clerk with the LA Superior Court said it ended in 2021. Licensed fiduciary was appointed as conservator for Mr. Reiner. It said mental illness is an epidemic that is widely misunderstood. This is a horrible tragedy. Both declined to provide further details, citing confidentiality. But the revelation of the conservatorship just echoes just how severe the mental health problem is and how this is likely going to be also partly used as the defense, even though it really shouldn't, in my opinion. But as we go through and catch up.
So the first question that comes to my mind is, okay, he was on a mental health conservatorship for a year. Why was he taken off of it? Because to me, the only reason why you'd be taken off of it is if you're showing drastic improvement, right? There was a reason why you went on. And maybe they said something along the lines of, okay, we'll do this for a year to see how it goes. And at the end of the year, we'll reevaluate this. Could that possibly be what it was? Perhaps, but let's see.
The article's reminding us of, yes, he had serious mental health issues that he struggled with, especially in the weeks before the arrest and the murders. And so to other people familiar with his health, it's interesting how many people are coming out of the woodwork to reveal his medical information. They told the New York Times under anonymity to discuss sensitive information. One of those people said he had been diagnosed at different times with schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder. So here you have the New York Times basically saying the same thing TMZ said, but claiming.
But here's the thing about it, right? We don't know all of the details of the conservatorship. Perhaps there was a lot of addiction stuff going on there at the same time. We don't know. And so if there's also addiction stuff, inherently, that makes someone more responsible at that point, where it's not just, oh, it's just a case of mental illness that's out of their control. I mean, that doesn't work in the eyes of the law for anything else, whether it's drinking and driving or other violent acts, right?
Their own sources. The medication Mr. Reiner had been taking was effective, but the side effects led him to switch to a new medication about a month before his parents were killed. Now, apparently TMZ is saying that medication was giving him too much weight gain, is what the rumors are. And that's why he was suddenly shifting his medication. Now, Mr. Reiner had battled addiction throughout his years, had been in a conservatorship, indicated that a judge determined he had a grave disability, meaning he was unable to provide for his basic personal needs for food, clothing, or shelter as a result of a mental health disorder. You have to be pretty severe to be placed in a mental health conservatorship in California. Of all the people who come into the system, a very small group actually get placed into on this type of conservatorship. It's known as an LPS conservatorship, the Lantern Patres Short Act. It's an involuntary psychiatric treatment in California, and different from the other types of conservatorship, particularly the Brittany one that takes over medical and financial decision making for people with dementia or developmental disability, which again, why that whole thing with Brittany made no sense. She was able to go work, but she wasn't able to control anything in her life. Make that make sense. It never will. Now, this LPS conservatorship originates from an involuntary psychiatric hospitalization and are initiated by a doctor. So he would have been put into a treatment center, like a psychiatric place, and then a doctor at that place would have to see the struggle and put him in there. So at the end of the day, it's a serious thing, right? It's a serious Office of Public Guard then assesses whether the conservatorship is warranted. They make their case to the judge. The system allows a professional conservator or a person close to the patient, such as a family member, to make decisions about medical treatment, including psychiatric medications. It lasts 1 year, after which the conservator has the opportunity to try to renew it. It's unclear why it didn't go beyond the year. Now, that's where I'm just confused. Again, not necessarily a dig at Nick or even the Reiners, but the system itself. So they put him in this conservatorship out of concern, issues that he's unable to take care of himself. They lock him in for a year under this plan. Someone's overseeing it. And then apparently after the year, it expired. And they were just like, okay, he's cured. He's solved. And then he was just sort of put back into the...
And that seems like a little bit of a negligent thing to do. If he was really that bad to be put on a conservatorship, you're going to have to see some evidence of progress to get him out, right? But for that to be lifted. And especially since now we know the future, perhaps his progress didn't warrant that. But again, we don't know what they were seeing at the time. We don't know. And we have the benefit of knowing how it turned out. And knowing how it turned out can actually prevent people from learning from history because you already know what happened, right? But if you're in the moment with all them, maybe you're thinking about things a little bit differently. I don't know. Like, until you know all of the details, it's really hard to say.
World. That's kind of crazy. It's kind of crazy. Now, I imagine they're going to use that as well in defense, showing his struggles with addiction and psychiatric holds, etc. But it's troubling to know that they thought it was that serious, but then they didn't. So it goes both ways. While he's going to use this as a defense, I would also say, well, then I guess the other side of the coin is he was well enough to be excused by the doctor, by the facility. So clearly something was right. And it does sound like that new medication that he was given is going to be the big defense that he's going after. And Alan Jackson's kind of implying that again, even further in this article. He did another appearance beyond the Billy Bush one. We're going to get to the Reiner family's frustration and reaction to this, but he also went on the Kelly Ripa Let's Talk Off Camera podcast because, everybody's got to have a podcast now. And they were sort of speaking around.
So of course, Alan Jackson's going to do the post Nick Reiner attorney tour. I mean, I feel like it's a big reason why you take this case. You want the notoriety, you want the big payday, and he'd already had notoriety, but this would have been the biggest case he ever had, right? So you can't be surprised that he's now going to do the podcast tour, right? The Billy and then whatever else he was on. Not surprising.
Down the case as best they could, because obviously he can't due to confidentiality, client attorney privilege. But Nick, so anyway, a lot of questions came up, but Jackson explained to Ripa that there are certain things that he simply can't divulge regarding the change in counsel. However, his team will always be committed to Nick's best interest. He added, I want him to get the most robust defense that he possibly can get. I know he will in the hands of the public defender. Ripa then asked Jackson how he argues cases that could be deemed indefensible. There's very little in the law that's indefensible. There's a reason for that. I never approach a case like I'm just defending an individual. We're defending the Constitution. We're defending an idea. We're defending the foundation of which this country was built in terms of the justice system. He's right. Everybody deserves counsel. That's how it works. Everyone's innocent until proven guilty. Jackson notes that
George says this guy looks like he ate all the popcorn, maybe some milkshakes too.
U.S. system grants people their God-given right of liberty that is built into the fabric of our country. But he said the justice system can remove someone's liberty, calling it an almost unthinkable action. There are certain circumstances in which it's absolutely appropriate. I don't have a problem with that if it's done perfectly. Notice he said perfectly. He continued by noting that with his approach, I don't worry about who the person is because the word indefensible never comes up. It's completely defensible no matter who the person is.
So they're saying that the family's upset because Alan Jackson went on the podcast tour, on the Billy, whatever his name was, and he also went on this other show. And they're saying that Romy and Jake are upset about that. I mean, I don't know what they expect. Just to kind of go quietly into the night. It's just not really the nature of this kind of case. And of course, you step down from being his lawyer, everyone's going to want to talk to you. And this is what it is.
Is that the government doesn't get it right. He then acknowledged that in certain circumstances, mental health is a factor. He then made a point to clarify, well, I'm not talking about Nick, but it's hard to not associate some of this with Nick. He proposed the idea that people who are sick are not punished for being sick. If someone has an epileptic seizure and they go unconscious and God forbid they're in a traffic accident or something happens and people lose their lives, we don't punish that as a crime. Again, if he's on the bad meds, the doctors did it and the meds did it, then he's not guilty. It's the meds' fault. It's the doctor's fault. We don't punish this country. We're very civilized. We try to be civilized. Before adding that the justice system will punish criminal conduct when there's an intent element. The system is built on to accommodate that, to address that. He said it's for a defendant who has mental illness, cannot form an intent and doesn't understand the character and quality of their conduct. Again, it's hard to not connotate this as a sort of subtle mention of what Nick Reiner's defense will be. He's then asked straight out, have you ever taken a case where you're like, this one's guilty, but I'm going to razzle dazzle it? I don't think like to think of it as razzle dazzle. The answer is no. I normally don't make pronouncements one way or the other about the guilt or innocence of my client because it doesn't matter to me, Jackson said. I really don't care. I care about the Constitution. I care about whether or not the government got the job right. So he's basically saying, if you don't prosecute correctly, well, then you didn't do it properly, and this person gets to walk. What do you think of Alan's sort of harsh comment?
I mean, and here's the other thing about that crime scene, and the same is going to hold true about the Tepe crime scene too. I would not be surprised if the Reiner household had tons of security footage of this entire act. And that's probably extremely brutal. And again, unless Nick had the wherewithal to disable all of the cameras, I mean, the Rob Reiner household probably worth at the minimum millions, if not tens of millions. And if a household is worth millions to tens of millions, there's going to be security. There's going to be video cameras. So somewhere that is out there, right? That is out there. But ultimately, I do think it was really more of money was the reason why. Now, again, any defense lawyer is going to tell you it's about the Constitution. And sure, that's true. Just like we went over a couple days ago. Sometimes innocent people are proved, they convict them. Innocent people get convicted. And in the worst case, they can be sentenced to death, right? But that's not the norm, of course. But you also hear stories of people being released from jail decades later because the person that accused them of something comes clean. That happens too. So that's the good of defense lawyers to me.
Comments there. If he kind of knows the person's guilty, he's still going to fight it as best he can to get them off if the other lawyers didn't do their job correctly. Do you agree with him? I'm curious. Now, given Alan's sort of comments where he isn't specifically talking about Nick, it's hard to not imply that he is. Apparently, the Reiner family is livid about all this, especially going on the Billy Bush podcast, which I think they're being unfair spotlighting him specifically. But apparently, they're furious at the former defense lawyer who went public on Billy Bush's Hot Mike's podcast. The whole thing feels like a show pony move. I mean, duh. What big lawyer like him isn't doing that? That's what lawyers do. Hello? A source close to the family tells me, why is he giving details to Billy Bush of all people? The family feels betrayed. Well, that's just a mean shot at Billy Bush. What's wrong with Billy Bush?
The family feels betrayed. I mean, that's a lot to say considering what I would presume is Jake and Romy pulled the plug on funds. Now, that's not confirmed, but that would be my guess. And then for them to say this about oh, he's betraying us. And again, unless he's just outright lying, Alan Jackson, he said it was out of his control and Nick's control. What other kinds of things would meet that criteria besides the money being pulled? I really don't know. I don't know. I mean, I don't think you take the case here knowing what happened if you're just going to back out because you see the footage. I don't think that would happen. I think if there's a knife attack, it's going to be pretty brutal. I mean, show me the knife attack that isn't brutal, that ends in death.
My God, they're gonna want justice for Nick, but Billy's still got to get called out for his whole entire life. Make that make sense. Leave Billy Bush alone. Jackson abruptly dropped his case in early January, leaving insiders scrambling. That's the first I've heard of that. That he abruptly dropped it and left everybody scrambling. And then he said, once I'm done, I'm done. I've withdrawn. Something happened with my ability and my team's ability to continue the representation, but I don't want anyone to speculate as to what that might be. I have not said a word about it, but rumors are that Nick was difficult, that they couldn't afford him. There was a lot of rumors that were coming in. Again, he then reminds everybody that he dropped everything to take on the case. Well, yeah, duh, because it's a big case. I show fealty and loyalty to the confidentiality that attends the kind of phone call. Immediately thereafter, I dropped everything. So the family's though mad because why are you going out there show ponying it up, doing interviews, talking about Nick? They just want the legal process to take its course without distractions. In this case, the spotlight may have shifted.
And that's just a naive way to see it. This is the most popular case of 2025 into 2026. I mean, they can't expect people to not talk about it. They can't expect Alan Jackson to simply refuse all interviews, even after he's not on the case anymore. To me, that's just unrealistic expectations by them. And granted, not that I want to be hard on Jake and Romy here. They're in an awful position where they lost their parents and they pretty much lost Nick too. And that's not an enviable position to be in any way. But even so, it's like, okay, Alan Jackson's his own man. He's going to do what he wants to do.
In exactly the wrong direction, and the Reiner family isn't letting anyone forget it. So there you go. Those are the latest. What do you think Alan Jackson's comments, his show pony tour? And are you surprised to see that Nick was in a conservatorship for a year and then the system let him out? Do you think that's a bad sign that Nick was wronged? Or do you think that's a sign that, well, the system said he's okay, so he's back out there? What's the issue here? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. Make sure you hit that subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the bell, as you know. Make sure it's all. And when you get those alerts, click the thumbs up. Please leave your comments. Help be part of the Planeteer crew.
So that was a short one by him there. And so now...
is Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi. Here now, Tony Bruschi.
The TMZ Rob Reiner documentary, probably the first of many, just dropped this last.
Ellie, he just went over it. Popcorn Planet just went over that they were upset about it. They're upset at Alan Jackson because Alan Jackson went on those podcasts and started talking about things. Not that he didn't even talk about anything, though. Alan Jackson didn't say a word. He just said things that people already knew. There was no new revelations there. Welcome, Phil Bradley.
Last week and confirmed what a lot of us suspected and really couldn't prove. Sources with direct knowledge say Nick Reiner reportedly admitted to killing his parents, Rob and Michelle Reiner, but allegedly doesn't understand why he's in jail. He believes he's the victim of a conspiracy, according to sources with TMZ. His medication for schizoaffective disorder was reportedly changed about a month before the murders because he complained about weight gain. Sources say his meds still aren't stabilized. He checked into a Santa Monica hotel after the alleged killings, then was found wandering near USC the following night. The murder weapon still has not been recovered, and legal experts are saying that this case won't see a courtroom for at least 2 years. Joining me to discuss, Robin Dreeke, retired FBI special agent and chief of the counterintelligence.
Which makes you wonder what happens to him in these 2 years. Like where he is right now, is it more of a mental health facility or is it more of a prison? Like which one is it? Or is there like an in-between there because he's not convicted yet? I don't know. What do you think the answer to that is, Chet?
Behavioral analysis program. Let's put on our behavioral analysis hats for a moment. Nick Reiner reportedly cycled through 18 plus rehab facilities over 3 decades, checking in, detoxing just long enough to satisfy the family, then leaving before any sort of real psychiatric work actually could take place. When you look at that sort of a pattern, what does it tell you about whether we're dealing with genuine treatment resistance here with somebody or a calculated system of manipulation?
I think it's a little bit of both, Tony. We keep looking at this case, and every time I look at this case, I'm trying to take a different optic and lens on it. And so this time, I'm really focusing, like you said, on those 18 times in rehab. Mm-hmm. I've been around, and we've talked about this before, we all have been around a lot of addiction with different people, different circumstances. And here's what really gets me with this one, especially since the statement he made about wanting to change his meds, the reason for it. That's when it really resonated with me. And that was everything he's doing continues to be all about him, appearances, self-centeredness. Someone that
So to reiterate why Nick Reiner's family's pissed, and really this just means Jake and Romy, they're mad that Alan Jackson was going on the podcast tour. So he went on the podcast tour with Billy and then the other guy, I think it was a woman though, and they're upset that he's actually going on these shows instead of just going silently into the night. I don't know what they expect. I think Alan Jackson, he's not on the case anymore, so he can do what he wants. He's a free man.
Eventually does get into rehab and wants to reform and wants to embrace and wants to get healthy and clean and overcome addiction, owns it. They own their behavior, and and that's the first thing is you let go. You just let go and admit that you're powerless. And he never did that once. I think everything was a control, a show, and never let go of 100% the victim mentality. The world is doing this to me. I'm the victim of conspiracy. I'm gaining weight. It's me, 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 me.
And that's one of the clues that I would say outside of a case like this, even a narcissistic person, one of the clues that they're not going to change is they play the victim. And they play the victim instead of taking accountability. But if you hear someone play the victim or deflect or do the Eeyore routine, you can be pretty sure they're not going to change. You can be pretty sure they're going to keep on doing whatever problematic behavior they've been doing. But if someone owns it, takes accountability, takes responsibility for their actions, and how do you know that someone actually owns it? Well, first, they admit they've done something. They admit it. And then preferably they will show genuine remorse that they actually did it. And then they put in the footwork to try to change that behavior. That's what you want to see. If you don't see that, you can be pretty sure they're not going to change one thing.
And when you're surrounded by a lot of loving people, not necessarily loving critics, they're going to keep exasperating that potentially. But anyway, regardless, 18 times that this person did not embrace.
Well, it's a good question, but in this case, it works. So how is saying one powerless against their addiction in any way a step in fighting one's addiction? Well, in the 12-step rooms, that's your way of saying, no, you can't even do one. You can't take any drinks or drugs, period. And that's their way of acknowledging that, because there are a lot of people where one is too many and 1,000 is never enough. They just drink one beer and they're gone. Now, is that going to be everyone's story? No, it's not going to be everyone's story. But I do think it's a fair amount of times true. How many people do you know where they'll say, yeah, there is not just drinking one beer? It's no, either 0 or 20. There's a lot of people like that. So in a way, it is a way of taking responsibility. Now, if you don't like that part of it, there's smart recovery that people can go to as well. So admitting you're powerless is acknowledging the truth. When I drink or when I use drugs, it gets out of control. So it's a way to acknowledge what is true for that person.
Embrace the fact that they are doing something wrong, not society.
Yeah, and at this point, I hear exactly what you're saying. I think that both can be, parallelly true at the same time. Where at this point,
so where Nick Reiner is, by the way, he's at the Twin Towers Correctional Facility, and I have heard that before. So Nick Reiner is being held at the Twin Towers Correctional Facility, a county jail in downtown Los Angeles, after being charged with murder and the deaths of his parents, Rob and Michelle Reiner.
Maybe he, really is thinking there's a conspiracy out against him. I mean, maybe that's legitimate. It's not just, part of the ploy of I'm going to have to play crazy right now in order to get a lesser sentence and not go to prison. Any path here is likely going to lead to some sort of a confined existence beyond just where he's sitting in jail right now. Very likely, even if he does go down the not guilty by reason of insanity, or maybe pleads guilty by reason of insanity, which could be a possibility there. A facility is certainly in his future. The not guilty route, I think that's the part that terrifies a lot of people, though, because it's the idea that he could get somewhere and be institutionalized for a while. And depending on what that sentence may be or not be, once deemed safe and okay to be out, he's better, could be released. That's not how it always works, though. There's many cases where they are there for a long time. But in that TMZ documentary, it was very interesting. They brought up the Carmichael case out of Canada, which also they had the McNaughton standard basically for proving insanity, basically trying to understand the understanding of what's the word on this one. It's not right and wrong. It's more specifically.
I only know the right and wrong.
It's I want to make sure the nature and quality. That's it. I got to think of a granola.
That's the thing. Some people really dislike the powerless part, and those are the people that would go to smart recovery. But this is where people just really need to be honest with themselves. Some people truly are. They truly are powerless, and their actions absolutely prove it. Now, if that's not their story, then yeah, go do another thing. Don't say you're powerless. Go to smart recovery or something else. But at the end of the day, your life is going to tell the story. Your actions of what you do in your life is going to speak the loudest of all.
Bar every time.
Yes, nature and quality.
Nature and quality.
The quality control.
Yeah, so they have to understand the nature and quality of what they were doing was wrong. Carmichael strangled his son. He was going through a medication change, but he also believed that he was basically doing the right thing, because in his mind, the medication has told him that he was saving his daughter, that his son was living a miserable life, and this was merciful to do. He knew it was wrong. He knew he was going to face consequences, even looked up like HIV/AIDS stats in prison because he was concerned about what was going to happen to him once he was arrested. But he still went through on it because he didn't understand the nature and quality of what he was doing. He believed he was doing it for a different reason, which was obviously not a sane reason, which is why it was not guilty by reason of insanity. Right. He also had no past, no past history of addiction or this and that and everything else, and a history of manipulating people left and right. So it's an interesting comparison because it may be applicable to Nick Reiner on what he was feeling in that exact moment of that exact night. But when you put everything behind it, the 17 years prior, that really
What powerless means, though, is not powerless over their actions. It's powerless once you put a drink or drug in you. That's the distinction. But as long as you don't put a drink or drug in you, then you are not powerless. But once you enter the addiction, then for a lot of them, their actions sure seem like they're powerless for a lot of them. So again, people can quibble with the definitions of it, but there's evidence 12-step programs work. There's also evidence that smart recovery works.
it creates a different monster, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so. It's a compelling case to look at, but at the same time, from everything I've looked at over the years and the cases we've covered, the bar to get to not guilty by reason of insanity and actually use an insanity plea is really high, much higher, I think, today than it was when I was growing up. At least I used to remember thinking I heard it more when I was growing up. Yeah. And also, but you hit the really key there. It's that lifelong pattern of really abhorrent behavior. And so had this been a one-off where you could say, oh, it was the medication, it was a psychotic event induced by that. And that's why they're going to really rely on a lot of really experienced clinicians in this doing the assessments, because it's not just the change of medication. You know, he has a pattern for 18 rehab attempts of really, really bad, abhorrent, unhealthy behavior for many, many, many years. And I think what will also come out is, you know, the pattern of escalating violence as well, or threat of violence and all those things. So this was not a one-off. So think about this. I think part of the argument for prosecution is probably going to use is this thing called choice. Mm-hmm. For 18 attempts, he made a choice that he was the victim. Granted, there's a lot of things going on in the brain with chemical imbalances and crap when you're under addiction, but at the same time, though, he constantly kept making a choice. Granted, it was a choice induced by drugs or whatnot, but he still.
So here's the thing with drugs, with Nick here. It is that much harder to get clean when there's also severe mental health stuff going on, but at the same time, it makes it that much more important that they do too. So both of those are true at the same time. It's harder when there's severe mental health stuff going on, but it also makes it that much more important because of exactly what happened. So again, some people go a little more lenient with trying to help them. Some people go a little more towards the tough love. Honestly, when it comes to addiction stuff, I lean towards more consequences and boundaries, honestly, because where for a lot of them, they're just going to take advantage of and exploit if you don't. And that's the other thing about it too, though, right? Where people don't like that part, but when it comes to addiction, it's true for a lot of people. And then you add some maybe vulnerable narcissism or other character issues, and yeah, that stuff's a problem.
Making a choice. So for a very long time, he is being responsible for his action, or should be accountable for his actions, to stay in those types of situations when given so many opportunities to make a choice to get yourself clean, get yourself out. And so I think that's going to weigh very heavily on this case of that pattern of crazy.
It's going to be interesting, and that's a question that I've been asking some of our attorney friends about this, or I'm going to be asking more of in the coming weeks as this continues to develop, is, what exactly would be admissible in a case like this if it ever gets to trial, which I'm going to guess this may end in a plea. But if this actually does get to trial.
And I would say those 12-step programs have variable relapse rates, especially for younger, simply because when you're younger, your frontal lobe in your brain isn't fully developed yet. Simply when you're younger, you're more immature. When you're younger, you have more raging hormones. You have all these things that are working against you. So I wouldn't necessarily blame 12 steps for that as opposed to the other variables, right? No matter what someone tries to do, no solution is going to be 100%, period. But when people are younger, they got things working against them, which isn't an excuse. It's just reality.
How much of Nick's bad acts in the past are going to be allowable into this? I think it certainly tells part of the story, and you'd certainly need the context. But how much gets in? Does 18 rehabs get in, or is it just a history of, it's going to be played a certain way depending on who's looking at this, and what exactly can be looked at in front of a jury should it get there, in terms of he's made these choices in the past over and over and over, and they were always the wrong ones. They were always self-serving. Or does the jury only get to see the snapshot of that 48 hours and that night, and just a snapshot of, see, when someone's going through a medication change, horrible things can happen to the brain. And this is what happened. Case closed.
You know, it's hard to imagine a situation, though, where a lot of people that had a lot of contact with him, including his siblings.
And I think with addiction rates across the board, old, young, regardless of what methods they choose, there's low success rates of everyone. Why? Because it's hard. Mental health and addiction issues are tough. So again, people got to find out what works for them, right? I don't care what works for somebody as long as it works for them. So if someone doesn't like the higher power / powerless part of 12 steps, then go to smart recovery. If smart recovery is not for you, go to something else. I'm not married to any one solution as long as they find something that works for them.
Which apparently don't look like they're going to stand with him on this, wouldn't be called to bear witness to his behavior and lifestyle and all these other things. I think one of the greatest things that's going to be a great resource for prosecution is all the people in the Reiner's lives. The transparency they had as a family with what they were dealing with meant they were broadcasting these things out. And so I don't think in other words, we've dealt with cases where there's a lot of hidden things where things were being shared publicly or kept in shadows. I don't think that's the case here. There's a lot of people that, because the Reiners were who they were, because of their transparency as a family, because of the vulnerability of who they were, led into their lives, and because of the kindness and generosity that the Reiners had, a lot of people want to be on their side. So you're going to get a lot of testimony, I would say, against Nick. I mean, we talked about it last show. He's not likable. And when you're not likable, the people you murdered are likable. And you have all these people extremely aware of your behavior for a very, very, very long time. That's a very tough road, I think, for defense to climb, no matter what's admissible or inadmissible. Regardless, people can talk and share their thoughts and opinions and their experiences.
TMZ reported that the family had basically grown used to Nick. I mean, that's understandable. It's basically conditioning. You sit there long enough with that sort of behavior around you. And
that's one of the tricky things, too, of addiction and mental health issues. It becomes normal, even when it's not. So there's all sorts of toxic behaviors and things that are not normal. But when you're used to it, and it's happening all of the time, it kind of becomes that family's normal. And it isn't until other people see it that aren't used to that kind of crazy where they'll say, oh my God, what the hell's going on here? But again, I don't know how often that was happening. I don't know how often Rob and Michelle Reiner were bringing people over to see that version of crazy. Maybe they weren't. I don't know. But clearly, though, they weren't against it completely, considering they invited him to Conan's party, which, again, I think that was another poor choice by them.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of get used to it. And what one on the outside may look at as being very extreme, when you're next to it every single day, you don't realize it. It's the frog in the boiling pot of water, or however you want to look at it. That being said, I'm really...
Good analogy there by Tony Bruschi. So for those who don't know, the frog in a boiling pot analogy of abuse is, if you throw a frog in a boiling pot of water, it'll jump right out. But if you put a frog in a pot of water and then slowly turn up the heat, the frog will boil to death. And the analogy is, in an abusive relationship, it's not boiling water right away. It's not that bad at first. Or if it is, you don't even notice it. But slowly over time, the temperature gets turned up. And then before you know it, you're in boiling water. So that's why they call it the frog in a boiling pot analogy of abuse, because it's usually not bad right away. But as time goes by, it gets worse and worse and worse. And the devaluing gets worse. And then maybe discards will occur. and then Hoovers will occur, and it can be a nightmare. And then in the worst case, it's Dr. Michael McKee bad.
I'm very curious as to what we are going to find out about life in that Reiner home, not just in those weeks leading up to this, but in the years, in the lifetime of the upbringing of the other kids' childhoods. They haven't spoken anything yet, other than the brief statements that they've given. But if this makes it to trial, I'm gonna guess they're gonna be witnesses. And I'm going to guess we're going to hear a lot about things in that home, a lot of struggles that we were not, privy to. And I'm guessing it's probably going to be somewhat shocking to a lot of people. I think it's good because it's going to raise awareness, as this already has, for this sort of thing that's going on. So if there's a silver lining in this, that might be more of it. But I'm wondering what we're going to hear and how that's going to be parsed out and phrased by the siblings on this. Is it going to be parsed out in a way of, we are frustrated as shit and Nick deserves everything he has coming to him because of his poor decisions? Or are we going to hear much more of a mental health struggle story and siblings that certainly want him to face consequences, but are more so telling it from a perspective of it's not as cut and dry and he's an evil addict as a lot of folks are going to be looking at this at. Ultimately, it's going to be a very fascinating story to hear.
Yeah, it will be. Again, my thinking hat on and my thought process says that when you have such lengthy years of exposure to this behavior, that, again, just my thought on it is that it was a household full of kindness, compassion, fear, and a lot of trauma bonding, of walking on eggshells, where you're waiting for, like, he's holding a good day, Nick holding a good day out for you in hopes that you're going to get one today if you behave a certain way. And so it's hard not to build up resentment at some point, no matter what, because you can imagine, again, your thought experiment hat on, that all right, early on when they recognize we have mental health issues, all right, so we're gonna do all we can to mitigate those mental health issues, and we do all the things. We get rehab, and we see doctors, psychiatrists, we get prescriptions, and it doesn't work. All right, we're full of kindness, we're full of grace, we're understanding of the mental health crisis and all that. We'll try this, we'll do it again, and they're all in compassion, grace, all the things that good, beautiful, healthy families have, and it fails again. Yeah. All right. So you see the exasperation starts to build. And at a certain point, when you're not the parents and you are siblings and other people in their lives, you're going to hit the tipping point where I think resentment starts building. When resentment starts building, watch out, because that is where people aren't necessarily going to be giving you the grace anymore, because resentment in this case would start building because we gave you all the chances to stop.
Okay, so he's saying the rest of the family might start building resentment. I don't know if that was true, which it very well might be. We haven't heard much about it though yet, right? But this is where the order of operations comes in for addiction. The first thing is getting clean, because if you're not clean, it makes everything 1,000 times more hard. And granted, it's not easy just to get clean either. And there also comes a point where the addict / person who's mentally ill, they have to take responsibility for themselves and their own recovery. They got to step up and do what's best for them. But if people around them are always hounding them and policing them, in a way, it can prevent people from growing and maturing in a way. At a point, they need to learn to sink or swim on their own. And again, if they don't ever do that, you might see cases like this.
Stop being a victim. We gave you the chances to take control of your life. Everyone's on you. In other words, everyone was on his side, yet he rejected it, saying, I'm still the victim. You're all against me. And so that, I can only imagine, again, the thought experiment of that is probably what's, I was going to guess would be the standpoint of the siblings and the friends and family.
And it's an interesting standpoint on this, where he is saying it's a conspiracy. I can see how he would feel like it's a conspiracy, like
a righteous one.
Yeah, it's a righteous one finally, but everything has flipped on him. Everything that was working, it was like he was in the Bizarro conspiracy forever,
right?
Of upside down land, where like this really shouldn't be a conspiracy, but it seems to be, to enable you to keep going in every which way, shape, and form. And now it's finally the other way. If your brain is already fairly broken, the way he's describing it from his perspective, it kind of is a conspiracy, just how he's thinking of it.
Yeah, it was a conspiracy to finally do what should have been done by all the people around him. I mean, so I agree, it is a conspiracy. It's probably the most accurate thing he said in a very long time. It was a conspiracy of everyone in your life that finally said, "Screw you! You went over the top. You killed your parents. The grace is gone." And the kind of going back to what you opened with, the thought.
So Robin here, he's a retired FBI special agent and an author. I'll be curious what he writes about. Now, no one's going to accuse Tony Bruschi of being too easy on Nick Reiner. If anything, he's got more with the prosecutor vibes.
Of him not, being able to say not guilty because of reason of insanity, the thought of eventually getting out or getting away with. This is one of those cases where this is a broken brain that cannot be fixed.
Yeah.
No. No.
So Brian asked a question to pose a debate. Who gets angry at diabetics? No one. But the big difference is usually when it comes to addictions, there's also some character stuff in there too, where most diabetics are not going to be lying, cheating, screwing people over to get their fix of insulin, right? This is usually just not how it goes. But those other things, they do a lot of things that harm other people. That's also one of the problems, right? But I know the argument is, well, if it's a mental health issue or it's a disease, why are we getting mad at them? Well, in 12-step programs, they say, don't get mad at the person, get mad at the disease. That's what they'll say.
Oh, it's no fixing this brain.
The question is now how many millions of dollars and how much resources are going to go into getting to this conclusion that everybody already knows the answer to. And that's where we're at. And obviously we'll keep digging into this as it continues. Give us your thoughts in the comments section on YouTube and also on our Substack channel, hiddenkillers.substack.com. The link is also in the description.
Want more on this case and others?
So I got two more here.
This is Hidden Killers Live with Tony Bruschi, Stacey Cole.
20. After years of addiction and erratic behavior, sources say his medication was changed about a month before the murders after he complained about weight gain, and that change reportedly sent him into a spiral. Now from jail, he allegedly admits he killed his parents, but believes his incarceration is part of a greater conspiracy against him.
That one kind of got swept under the rug, didn't it? So allegedly, he admits to killing his parents in jail. Allegedly. We didn't hear too much about that when it came out, did we?
Meds still aren't stabilized. In our conversation today, we're going to be breaking all of this down with psychotherapist and author Siobhan Scott. We're going to be talking about the psychology of Nick Reiner, trying to understand the schizoaffective disorder that's going on, maybe why he's thinking this is a conspiracy. We're also going to dive into the family system, how the Reiners became trapped in this cycle that they could not escape. And we're also going to dive into the system that failed him, the treatment, the autonomy, and why 18 rehabs did not seem to be enough to keep Nick Reiner in a safe place or those around him. Siobhan, welcome. I always look forward to our conversations. Let's just jump in with the schizoaffective disorder itself. It combines features of schizophrenia, delusions, hallucinations, disorganized thinking with mood disorder symptoms like mania and depression. It sounds like a living hell for anyone who may have this. And it is a very real thing. For people who aren't familiar with the diagnosis, what does daily life look like for someone trying to manage this condition? And how does it differ from just schizophrenia alone?
It's hell for people trying to.
I mean, this is a very good question, right? Because this is something that people who are in this spot, this is what they're going to have to deal with. And I will be inviting Siobhan Scott on the show here too.
Manage it. The thinking problems interfere with their perception of the world. They don't know what's real, what's not real. If they're having delusions and hallucinations, it's incredibly unpleasant. Nobody would ever say, oh, gee, I'm going to fake schizophrenia. I just want to have this. You know, it's a terrible disease. It impacts every part of their life. And then when you throw in the mood disorder, which is the affective part of schizoaffective, that means they have incredible times of depression. And then
with each new thing, it gets that much harder, right? So there's addiction, mood disorders, mental health conditions like schizophrenia, personality disorders. There is neurodevelopmental stuff going on, such as autism. And I guess maybe you consider ADHD that, or is ADHD more of a process? I think it's neurodevelopmental though. But each one of those things you add on, it just makes addiction recovery that much more difficult. So what I try to say to people is you got to reduce it down. You reduce it down. But any way you can, you eliminate the drugs first or the drinking first to see what you have left over. And then you work on dealing with that so that you can establish a good baseline. And maybe your baseline includes meds. Maybe your baseline, for some people, maybe you just need some supplements and some good sleep, diet, and exercise. And you would say, now, probably not for severe mental illness, right? But for less severe, maybe that's all you need. But again, whatever works for each individual person. And it's not easy. And I always acknowledge for myself, there was a lot of luck involved in my story as well. Some things that really helped me, I had no intention of finding. And sometimes the universe or whatever just put me into situations where I was forced to sink or swim.
It can go into mania, which means, you know, people often think of mania as the happy manic, right? The bipolar, oh, when they're manic, they're happy. No, a lot of times they become irritable, paranoid, agitated, they pace. And so when you put those two conditions together, you've got somebody that is going to be very hard to treat, even without the substance abuse. But then you throw the substance abuse in, particularly meth, as we've said, that impacts the brain even more. And so I can understand why stints in rehab, even very good rehabs, this is going to be a person who maybe it just never works for them.
And she's absolutely right about this, right? It's going to be tough, let alone when you just for mental health stuff, it's going to be tough. Whether it's mental illness, mood disorders, but then you throw in an addiction on top, especially something severe like meth, and holy mackerel, it's hard. And there's a reason why a lot of people just don't make it, or they live a life that is below their potential. And that's what I always felt that my life was going to be like. If I didn't do something different, the ceiling of my potential was just lowered. And you know, I'm grateful I found what I did so that I can do what I'm doing today.
Prevalent in society is somebody with this kind of disorder. Is this a rare thing, or is this, wow, they are everywhere in our world? I just don't have a concept of how prevalent this is.
Yeah. I would have to look up data on schizoaffective disorder. I'm going to guess about 3%.
Okay.
You know, it's not terribly common.
And Brian, I'll play along with this. So there are probably diabetics that are also assholes. Now, it doesn't mean them being diabetic is what's causing them to be an asshole, but assholes can be anyone. Any type of person you can think of, mentally ill, a mood disorder, addiction, fill in the blank with anything, they can also be an asshole. It doesn't mean it has something to do with that original thing, but any human being, period, can simply be an asshole. And that's something you can't forget. Don't forget that.
Common, but because of the meth epidemic, we are seeing a lot more that's meth induced. When we look at, the non-drug induced.
So, I mean, I kind of tongue in cheek, but I created the cluster W personality disorders. So cluster W, cluster wizard. And so one of them I came up with was a diagnosed asshole. And I came up with criteria for it too. It's someone that does something that's rude or obnoxious, or it starts with asshole behavior. An asshole behavior is a behavior that is rude or obnoxious, extremely selfish, or inconsiderate. And if you do enough asshole behaviors consistently, now you're a diagnosed asshole. So the first question would be, name me an asshole behavior that doesn't fit that criteria of rude or obnoxious, inconsiderate, or extremely selfish. I don't think you can. But and again, anyone can be an asshole, not just narcissists, not just psychopaths, but anyone, period. And to me, it's a good go between like the average person and then jumping straight to narcissistic operating system or NPD. It's like, nah, there's probably some assholes out there too that maybe don't even have a narcissistic operating system, but they're certainly still assholes. That's a thing too.
Condition, there's genetics involved. They've inherited this from someone. It was in their genes from the get-go. And there are times when the brain is developing rapidly in late adolescence, early 20s, when it usually starts to manifest. And that's also about the age when people are experimenting with meth. And I say meth because that is the most toxic to the brain, that is proven over and over to cause psychosis. And so some people have a meth-induced psychosis that's later diagnosed as schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. And we don't really ever have a way of taking apart, would they have developed this if they had not used the drugs? So it's kind of a mess. And I think when we see the homeless population on the street, particularly people who are committing violent crime, so much of it is meth induced. And
yeah, I agree with that. So a lot of the violent crime in particular is meth induced. Probably some is booze induced as well at a point. But that's the chicken or the egg problem too. It's, can you drug yourself with something like meth into actually having real schizophrenia? Or is it just schizophrenia-like symptoms? I don't think they really have an official answer to that. Neither one of them would surprise me per se.
we're seeing a lot of that. So it's hard to sift it all apart.
Is this something, because obviously Nick has a long pattern, 17 years here from the first, documented rehab stay to the tragedy that they're dealing with today. But 2020 was when he was diagnosed with a schizoaffective disorder. Is this something where he likely had it all of his life?
That's a good question by Tony, but let's get to this first. Thank you very much, Farley. My stepbrother was like Nick. My stepmom/father didn't do anything and thought it was funny. He SA children. That's not very good. Drugs. He got all the attention. We resented him when he was unalive. We felt free. Did he do that to himself, or did he just on his own, like naturally? No, but that's understandable, though. When they're causing that much harm and destruction to the people around them, it's just a normal human response to feel like relief and to feel free from that. And I'm very sorry you had to deal with someone in your family that was like that. It's terrible.
and it was finally recognized at a certain point in time, or was it something where this was? I know you just kind of said it's difficult to identify the chicken before the egg here, but is this something where it could have been brought on more by the drug use, or just more so exacerbate an existing problem that maybe existed but wasn't to the height to which it got, but it has always just been kind of there, and this gave it the water to grow.
Yeah, the majority of people with schizophrenia or schizoaffective, the symptoms become really obvious in their late teens into their 20s, but it can happen later and it can happen earlier. And so you can see children, I've seen children as young as 8 diagnosed with childhood schizophrenia, and that's younger. And a lot of times in the early years, the symptoms are not as overt. We call it the prodromal symptoms, the symptoms that happen earlier. And that's a kid who may just be very odd. And
that's an interesting one. An 8-year-old diagnosed with schizophrenia. I'll be curious what that looks like versus someone that maybe is on the spectrum, what that looks like. So you can really determine what the difference is.
often they have social problems. They may have a lot of strange beliefs, but it's not really flagged. They're noticed as an odd kid, but they're not acutely psychotic yet.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's hard to say at what age this may have actually started to manifest for him. I have seen in some of the buzz online that he was having problems as young as 8 years old. And so that makes me think early onset.
We did see that he did have issues when he was younger, right? With the yoga people that came into their house, he would be entitled and throw temper tantrums and throw fits. That was happening since he was a young age. Now, is that schizophrenia? Possibly. She seems to think so. Siobhan seems to think so. But I often wonder if that's not the only thing that was going on. And I've heard people throw around the word psychopath, but I have not heard people really talk about the narcissism, vulnerable narcissism part like I have. I haven't heard anyone say that.
And that the condition could have been there, from the get-go and manifested later. It could be that without the substance abuse piece, it never would have gotten severe because, it's on a continuum. People can be mildly schizophrenic or moderately or extremely. And
that's another good point too. If they never did severe drugs like meth, crack, coke, fill in the blank, not as much opiates, but usually those stimulants are the ones that are really bad for the brain. Maybe they don't get as bad. Maybe it's just way more manageable if they never do those things. That's true too.
It might not have progressed to the extent it did without the substance abuse. But that's what makes it really hard to treat. And those are people, when we look at the prognosis for them, it's not necessarily very good.
How difficult is it to find a baseline in somebody that is actively using illicit drugs with schizophrenic disorder?
That's a very good question by Tony. How hard is it to find a baseline? And I would say it's extremely difficult. But number one is getting clean from all substances for at least 6 months to a year. Then you have a baseline. And once you have a baseline, and granted, once you're very clean, even sugar and caffeine can trigger little mini episodes when your system is clean enough. Ask me how I know that, because I did. And so you get rid of drugs and alcohol, sugar and caffeine become powerful to you when you get rid of everything. But then say, okay, he's clean for 6 months to a year. Well, then you look at the meds. Okay, is he going to be on an antipsychotic? Seroquel, Zyprexa, Geodon, maybe a mood stabilizer. We heard he was on Wellbutrin before, right? But that's what's necessary. To do that, get a good baseline. Once you have a good baseline, you can start from there. But some people, they just never find a good baseline their entire lives. But that's one of the things that really helped me, getting a good baseline where I felt like, okay, I can get through the day without needing to jump outside of my skin or try to alter how I feel. Like that was huge. And granted, you could argue I still do because I drink coffee every day, right? Like, oh yeah, coffee changes how I feel a little bit, but it's a socially acceptable drug, we'll say.
Like the schizoaffective disorder, like Nick has. We're talking all those years, so 17 years, where he's going through treatment after treatment. He's in there for 30 days. He gets clean and then gets back onto drugs. How difficult is it to recognize, okay, there's this disorder at play here versus this is the addiction at work, to treat if there's never really a clear long-term path where he's clean?
Yeah, it's pretty impossible to know who he would be without the substances. And it's unfortunately really common to see this sort of thing. I mean, it's not as
and this is also true. I mean, and as someone in the chat mentioned, I think it was Tina. Yeah, I totally think he was entitled and had bad character and was envious and had covert grandiosity that wanted to come out. Like when he's talking about being envious of his dad, Rob, and his grandfather, what is that? I mean, that's like a vulnerable narcissism coming out. And then you hear how he talks on the Dopey podcast. You hear the kinds of jokes he makes and what other people have said about him. And in particular, that one story of the woman that ended her own life that he told on the Dopey podcast, that speaks to someone that just doesn't have empathy. Right? When you're able to tell that story without caring at all, without any concern or care in your voice, not good. Not good.
It's common. It's not like everybody has somebody like this in their neighborhood. But if you work in an inpatient program, you see this where it's just intransigent. There's a word that when I worked in community mental health, they used to term, oh, somebody's a frequent flyer. And it's because treatment just wasn't effective and they kept coming back and coming back and coming back.
So, Anne, when you say we need to deal with it together, what do you mean by that?
Reading it was 0.3% to 1% of the population. It's relatively rare if that's exactly what he's got.
Yeah.
So he would be someone that I would consider vulnerable narcissism. Now, vulnerable can also be covert as well, though, right? It depends on who you talk to. My definition of covert is it's basically all the traits of narcissism. They just come out in a covert way. That's my definition of covert narcissism. Vulnerable narcissism is more along the lines of you don't see it as much, but there's a lot of the victim routine. There's a lot of the grandiosity that wants to come out. A lot of the bitterness and envy. And it's someone that fits a lot of what we heard Nick Reiner is like. But again, some people confuse them all. I think that happens too. And like covert narcissism, for example, you're not even going to see that in the DSM. It's grandiose and vulnerable. Those are the only two that you're going to see.
That sounds
diagnosed
about right.
though. I'm curious because we see stats like this all the time where it's like it's this percentage, it's that's that percentage. In your experience, I'm always curious here. What's the realistic number? What's the number if everyone who truly had this were recognized and diagnosed? How much higher do these percentages go in your opinion, in reality, if everyone was truly being diagnosed?
That's an excellent point because as I have talked about in my family history in my book, I think
Nick had a covert grandiosity that really didn't come out until he was actually like on substances or something. Then you see more of it come out. But again, all narcissists can be passive aggressive, right? They're not all going to be just one way aggressive or the other way. And like there's a lot of overlap in a lot of these things too. What differentiates it to me, I think, is more of the personality type as well. But even that being said, you can be very outgoing and extroverted and still be a covert narcissist. Like that's also true. But regardless of all of these labels and pinpointing it, it's more important to recognize just the behaviors, period. Like, okay, that was grandiosity. That was entitledness. That was a lack of empathy. that was being passive aggressive, that was fill in the blank, lying, or just having bad character. Understanding that is way more important.
Had an aunt with clearly schizophrenia who lived with us off and on because she couldn't function. She was never diagnosed until very late in life. I think she was in her 60s before she was diagnosed, but she was having hallucinations and delusions the whole time, her entire life. And nobody got it. Nobody got it. They thought she was just difficult. They called her, the old-fashioned term, she was ornery. She was ornery. She was just causing trouble all the time. And people didn't understand mental illness. This was in the 60s and 70s. And
so one of these days, I'll make a video like describing what I think is the difference between covert, grandiose, and vulnerable, because I do think they can be three different things. They're very similar, by the way, because they're all the same traits, but vulnerable and grandiose are different versions of the same traits. And covert is just a way to describe, okay, you have all these traits, but they're coming out in a covert way, which makes them harder to detect.
Nobody ever diagnosed her. So there's probably a lot of people who have a difficult family member that they don't understand. How do we cope with them? Maybe they get fed up with them. They burn the bridge, they cut ties. And a lot of people are not ever diagnosed.
Wow.
So some people say that the covert and overt are really just self states, to which sometimes, but like I do think there's people that are majority of the time going to be one or the other. There's people that are definitely more overt, and there's people that are definitely like more covert, right? And I know some coverts off the top of my head. They're never like overt about it. It's always covert. And I wouldn't necessarily consider what they're doing vulnerable narcissism either. So again, it gets tricky. It's so tricky to really parse these out.
You've just described a bunch of people that we've worked with. I'm just going to say that.
I mean, I feel like this, I mean, not necessarily schizoaffective disorder, but I feel like there's tons of undiagnosed mental illnesses everywhere.
Yes.
That if diagnosed correctly and treated effectively, people could be a hell of a lot happier and could be in a much better place in life, but we don't do that, or we're not equipped to do that. We're not capable of doing that as a society, at least not yet. Let me ask you this about Nick Reiner. If this was always something that's been there, it was looked over. Obviously, money was not an issue. He went to pretty much every of the best rehabs that have been out there and all of that. This took till 2020 to be diagnosed. Today, if there was 14-year-old Nick Reiner today, and this started, and his journey through all this was just beginning, are we any better today?
This is a good question by Tony. Tony's asked him some good questions in this one. So say someone has all of the same conditions that Nick Reiner did at the age 14. What do you do? What do you do? Maybe they're schizophrenic. Maybe they're undiagnosed on the spectrum. Maybe they're showing cluster B traits. Maybe they're starting addiction. Maybe they have a mood disorder. What do you do? What do you do to try to prevent this very situation from happening? Let's see what your answers are in the chat, and I'll come up with something in a minute too.
Than we were 17 years ago, or say 30 years ago, at identifying these sort of things and treating them earlier in children or young adults than we were back then?
I think we're better at it. And again, I always say, I don't have data to show how much better are we, but it all depends on the quality of care, and can you get access to a good psychiatrist, psychologist. They should have in-depth psychological testing. And, we're doing a lot of slapping easy diagnoses on now with everybody's got ADHD, everybody's on the autistic spectrum. I mean, I think
everyone's a narcissist.
Everybody's a narcissist. 9 out of 10 people I know believe they have ADD and autism now, And so I think we get on these bandwagons.
And I would say some people do throw around those terms willy-nilly. That does happen sometimes, which is why I've also said, don't bother calling someone a narcissist, even if it's true. It's not like they're going to agree with you anyway. they'll just fight it or they'll flip the script back onto you. And I forget what else I was going to say about it. But also, like, I consider myself someone that was undiagnosed on the spectrum, but I also had the terrible life experiences that kind of showed it. Like, oh yeah, you go and you do things like heroin and methadone and you become a felon. Like, that's not like normal things usually. So I'm not talking lightly when I say I did. It's like, no, I had some wild stuff happen to me. I'm lucky to still be alive.
Sometimes where maybe it's a pediatrician, they do a checklist, they go, okay, ADHD, let's give ADHD meds. So it really depends on the quality of the evaluation. And I'm a big believer in child psychologists.
And I shouldn't say what happened to me. The only thing that happened to me was being undiagnosed on the spectrum. The rest of it is what I did. That's what I did in large part because of it. But like, it was my choices, the rest of it.
Who specializes in testing, and don't go with an easy diagnosis without the testing. And so I think it probably varies from community to community what the resources are. But like you say, the Reiners had resources, but we also know that they put him in a wilderness program when he was 15. Totally inappropriate for somebody who's got budding psychosis, because those programs will make it worse. They're incredibly stressful. A lot of people feel like they're borderline abusive. You know, kids have died out in the wilderness in these brutal conditions. So
brutal conditions. So they're saying he had psychosis and those kinds of things would make it worse. Again, here's a catch-22 as well. I was undiagnosed on the spectrum, but I'm also kind of glad I didn't get treated differently either. Like, there were some certainly negatives of it, but I think in a way, if you're treated too differently, it can almost like hurt you in a way. So again, I don't know how bad Nick Reiner was at that age, but she's apparently saying, oh no, he should have been treated differently and not going on to those wilderness things. I don't really know what was going on in those wilderness things, so it's hard for me to say.
I can say that was bad judgment. And did somebody advise them to try this for him? Did they get sold a marketing package that this is going to fix your kid? I don't know. So I would love to have the ability to go through all his medical and treatment records, because I think it would fill in the blanks on a lot of this stuff.
The wilderness treatment screams of desperation to me. Like, they've tried everything else. We're just going to throw them to the wolves, almost literally.
Yeah.
Well, that'd be great. Well, we have.
I mean, I don't know if I agree with that. Well, I mean, what age was he when they did that? Did they say he was 14, 15? I missed it. Did they say how old he was when they were?
Live wolves that your children will be living around, and see if they survive. If they come back, they're healed. You know.
Yeah.
I'm curious about some of these programs, and we don't know the specific ones that he was in, other than.
And again, like, you just need to know what your kid's capable of. Like, there's different ceilings. Like, there's some people are just not going to be able to do better than a certain place, and I mean, most parents are probably going to not want their kids to have such a low ceiling. And again, there's two parts of it, right? What is their actual ceiling? And then what do people think the ceiling is? So I don't know. Of all the things they did, I'm not going to fault that one as much.
Yes, there has been allegations that he was in a wilderness program and God knows what else. And on the surface, I'm sure you can find, an introduction YouTube video or a website for most of these places. And I'm sure it looks soft and cuddly and warm and lovely and healing and refreshing and rejuvenating and whatever other, keywords you want to throw in there that make it think, oh, finally, we found a solution. And if you're the parents of Nick Reiner or anybody that's struggling with a child that is either suffering from mental illness or addiction or both, hearing those words is going to be a breath of fresh air, especially if you're like new to the cycle of
Yeah.
this and you're not 17 in. If it's new, you're like, wow, this maybe this will work because nothing else that we've tried so far hasn't. How much vetting do these sort of programs actually do?
And that's a good point there, Ty. It's he's in a free wilderness program now. And again, that's part of it too, right? Where you don't want to coddle him either. I feel like are wilderness programs really that abusive? I mean, I wouldn't think they're abusive at all, right? They're just, you're with a group of people and you're out there in the wilderness, like with community and friends. I mean, or like older adults. I don't know. I think of all the things. I wouldn't point to that being as like, oh my God, that wilderness program was the straw that broke the camel's back. No, I would say probably getting $10,000 a month and then maybe spending it on drugs. That's much more of a straw that breaks the camel's back. And now here he is in prison, which is 1,000 times worse than, or the Twin Towers facility is what it is. That's 1,000 times worse than any wilderness program.
For the people that they admit. And it probably, I'm sure, varies from organization to organization. But I'm wondering how many of these are just kind of out there on their own. There's not a lot of supervision. There's not a lot of checks and balances on the system. If you got a license and you're not killing people, we'll pretty much let anybody in as long as your check clears. Is that kind of how a lot of these work? Or do they take a look at the individuals that go into these and go, yeah, this would be applicable for this person because of this, and this, or no, this would not be applicable.
So what is going on these wilderness programs that they're hurting so many people? Like, can someone tell me what's even going on in them?
Because their symptoms are this, and this is not going to be for them? Or is it more that rubber stamp type thing, like, thanks for the check, here's your sleeping bag?
Yeah, let me reflect on that. I think most do a good job of assessment and diagnosis. I mean, they have to be assessed before they're accepted into the program.
Mm-hmm.
I think usually they've got good clinicians. They try to do an accurate assessment. But is there a profit motive in America for everything about healthcare?
Mm-hmm.
Undoubtedly, there's a bias that keep the beds full because
I mean, in a way though, too, could you say the same thing about a camp? Can there be abuse in any camp? I mean, anywhere you go where there's your peers, there's the possibility of bullying and abuse, no? So it's like, okay, are schools abusive? Well, you go to school, there's plenty of abusive people and bullies in school too, right? So like, again, to me, it depends. And there's going to be an element of danger no matter where you go with other humans. Humans are the dangerous ones. And wherever you go with them, there's going to be the possibility of danger. You mix people cross-gender, well, guess what? Now there's the danger of SA and sexual intercourse, right? So it's just the danger of being with humans.
the beds are full, we're making profit. And obviously, a lot of these really expensive places that offer yoga and massage and, vegan food if you want it, and all these things, they cater to celebrities and people with a lot of money. And it would not be unusual to find that perhaps they're admitting people that, is not the best fit for them. It's really hard to say. I do know Sierra Tucson, I can recommend.
So people can be tortured at camps. I would say kids torture other kids too at school. I mean, literally, so that kids will end their own life because other kids have bullied them. So again, I'd like to know, like, what's an example of one of these camps? What's the name? What are the people that have gone there? Are all the camps the same? Is it specific camps that are bad? It's like, we got to be careful painting with a broad brush.
And in Tucson, which is, I think I've had a client there. I actually went and visited, an impeccable program. They do psych testing. They do in-depth psychiatric care. They treat dual disorders. They treat eating disorders, substance abuse, and they're stellar. But there are a lot of places in California that are really expensive and fancy and cater to celebrities. And I think some are probably very good, but I can't speak for all of them.
Yeah.
What sort of checks and balances exist into any of this stuff to determine, how effective they are, how ethical they are, how safe they are? I mean, is there anything? Is there anybody going in and monitoring this sort of stuff to make sure that some of these aren't just a cash grab and basically predatory behavior on the risk?
So this is also what I would say, like in religion, yoga camps, spiritual retreats, these wilderness camps, anywhere where you can isolate people and have power and control over people, regardless of what the cause is, whether it's religion, spirituality, yoga, these wilderness retreats, it might attract some unsavory characters. Anywhere where there can be power and control over others that has the potential to be abused, you can see that. Just like in any workplace, you can see abuse. There can be toxic workplaces, right? So, but like when there's toxic workplaces, you wouldn't think then, oh, well, all jobs are toxic. Like, no, some are. And I have no doubts there are some wilderness programs that are toxic and abusive, just like there are some churches that are toxic and abusive, and fill in the blank with whatever else.
That can afford these sort of things, that are looking for help and have the means to go, yeah, whatever it is, here's more money. Let's try and fix this problem.
I think there are checks and balances. These hospitals have to be accredited by the state as far as their practices, to make sure that they're not just warehousing people, doing no treatment and collecting the money. And so I think they have to be accredited. And I'm not sure how often auditors come around, but auditors do go around and look at records, look at the treatment program, look at what's offered. Do they keep, I don't know that they all keep outcome studies. They should be keeping outcome studies. I think they do on, how effective is what they do. But obviously with cases like Nick Reiner that are incredibly difficult and complicated, there's probably not a program in the world that could have really made a dent.
So here's the thing. So who described this? That describes strip searches, bathroom restrictions, and having to read upsetting letters from the parents aloud? Was this just one example of a wilderness retreat? So of course, if this is what's going on there, that's bad. Now, granted, when I worked at a drug and alcohol rehab for teens, depending on how you label this, we did search kids for drugs. So depending on how you label it, would they call that a strip search? I don't know. But you can see how a strip search can be depending on how you've labeled the same thing, right? Well, you're not allowed to have drugs in a teen alcohol facility, right? And so they would actually make people get down to their boxers and whatever. So again, how would you label it?
What was going on with him?
Yeah.
Are there areas of this, and I'm not speaking specifically to Nick Reiner, but to our audience that's listening to this that may be in similar situations, because we have so many people who have been finding this very valuable and very interesting, watching this play out, who have been in similar situations. I'm thinking back to like Ruby, Frankie, Jody, Hildebrandt, where they're not therapists.
Right.
Jody was for a while, lost her licensing, and then became a life coach.
Yeah.
And look, I'm sure there's lovely, decent life coaches out there that are effective, that it just is what it is. And I'm sure there's predatory ones too. And there's probably ones that don't even know they're predatory. They're just psychotic, but think that they're, they have a God complex going on about them, kind of Jody Hildebrandt-ish. Does that exist in this sort of area as well for rehabilitation, where there's the official, there's the therapeutic, there's the, yes, we are accredited and we are governed this way. And then there's one over here that looks almost identical, but their disclaimer says it all of this is.
I think one of the first things to deal with is figuring out what it is you're dealing with in particular. That's number one. You got to address what you're dealing with properly. A lot of people get misdiagnosed with all sorts of things, right? And this is one of the benefits, I think, of a spiritual program that's not toxic, by the way. And that would be an issue with some religious programs too. They can be toxic and religiously abusive, whatever. But I do think one of the things that happened to me from going to 12-step programs is you find the right ways. And it's so hard for me to say exactly what it was, but it seems like there was things like bigger than me working in my life that pointed me in the right direction. And maybe there were sometimes people I met there, but from doing that and showing some willingness, I found solutions and I was able to do much better. So in a way, I think that place really helped me because of that. So it helped me to figure out what was really going on, but you have to address it for what it is first. And I think it also helps, like when they talk about the disease of addiction in a 12-step program, they talk about the disease of total self-centeredness and how people often lie and are manipulative. And so you address those things and you try to be a better person. And does trying to be a better person ever hurt you? I don't think so. So I think it's another way that people get helped from going to those programs, and you're more likely, in my opinion, to get pointed in the right direction. That's just my opinion.
Not this. It's a life coaching type of situation.
Yeah, I'm sure there are those things. And life coaches, there are a lot of programs that are residential in nature, which you could call like a halfway house or something like that. They don't have professional staff. Some of them are based on an AA model, which can be very helpful. But they would certainly miss psychosis if somebody was in a situation like that, because they don't have mental health people on staff. So there's a lot of that, particularly around substance abuse rehab. If it's a non-accredited, non-hospital kind of based program, or an official hospital sponsored, sometimes they have outpatient programs where people go to groups every day and get daily support, but you have real therapists running them and real psychiatrists involved.
What's your take on the reasoning for the medication change? Sources are saying that Nick was stable on his medication until about...
That's a good question too. But also, just like we know with narcissism and therapists, right? Therapists are not perfect. And therapists don't always understand. Like, some therapists are good, others not as much. It just depends. So so often we hear in the narcissism space, my therapist didn't understand narcissism. And in fact, they made it worse, or they abused me, or they told me to empathize with my abuser or try to be more understanding. So again, you want to go for people that are have a specialty, because they're going to be the people that are going to be able to help you the most.
A month before the actual murders. Great. But doctors changed it after he complained about weight gain, which is a common reason people change medications.
Yes, it is.
This is not a unusual thing to Nick Reiner. Is it vanity related? Yeah, but it can also be health related too, if somebody doesn't want to put on weight. What does a transition like this typically look like for someone with schizoaffective disorder? Is it a safe proposition to be like, okay?
So he's asking here what prompted the med change, because they said that Nick was fairly stable. What I heard before was the weight gain. The weight gain, he wanted to switch the meds to get rid of the side effects. And then guess what? It wouldn't surprise me at all if he stopped the med and is like, you know what also might help a little weight gain? Maybe the old methamphetamine diet, maybe.
Yeah, we can change that. And you're just going to be in the care of your 78-year-old father and your 70-year-old mother in the guest house. Does that typically work out okay? I mean, normally it's going to be somebody in their bedroom or on the couch of mom and dad. In a lot of situations here, does that normally work out okay? Or is this something where he really should have been in some sort of an inpatient 24/7 monitored facility to go through this experience?
Well, we can look at it with hindsight and say he should have been in the hospital for this.
Right.
But I can tell you, I have never seen a case where a med change was done and they put someone inpatient just for the med change.
Okay.
What's usually done is, you've got your inpatient program which is entirely separate from the doctor that's following him outpatient.
Mhm.
And often they're not well coordinated. And so without his medical records, we don't know which doctor and which program did the med change.
So is she implying that no one goes into inpatient for just the med change? So it must have been something else going on too? Maybe active drug addiction? Is that what she's saying here? Is she implying that? What do you think, chap?
What was the full rationale for the med change? Because my guess there were other things that were possible side effects that he was complaining about. And doctors vary. Some are very cautious about med changes.
Mhm.
And I've seen that, particularly if someone is very ill. But also there are doctors that tend to be more humanitarian, we'll say. And if a client is really troubled by side effects, they try to support, okay, let's try something different. But they'd have to document in the records what was the rationale for changing, one antipsychotic for a different antipsychotic. And it could have been a completely legitimate rationale.
You can't go inpatient without a diagnosis? Was that a DX diagnosis?
So they wouldn't have expected that there was going to be this reaction to it. But it's usually managed outpatient. And what should happen is very close follow-up. Like if you do this, if we do this med change, I want to.
Well, to be clear, you certainly don't need a diagnosis to go to addiction rehab. That's not required to go there at all. I don't know what the rules are for like other mental health related things. I mean, for insurance purposes, you need all sorts of things. But if it's not coming down to insurance and you're paying out of pocket, maybe rules don't apply as much in those cases where they'll say, oh, actually, this rule was really just for insurance. But now that you have the money out of pocket, you can come in. I don't know.
See you again in a week. And is it possible that they tried to do that and he didn't show up for the appointment?
A lot can happen in a week.
A lot can happen. Yeah. And the other thing, if I were involved in this case, I would want a daily phone call from the parents. How's he doing? What are you noticing?
And is he taking his medication?
Is he taking it? And this is incredibly difficult to know. How do they know if he swallows the pill? It's called.
But what's the significance of a diagnosis, though? Like in an addiction rehab, you don't need a diagnosis at all, for one. But if it's a mental health place, like maybe you go there because you're trying to figure out what it is. So why do you need a diagnosis to figure out what it is? Like, I don't understand. Is it just for insurance purposes that it's a thing? Or is there some other reasoning? Because it just seems like a silly, arbitrary rule to me. And granted, just because I think it's silly doesn't mean it's not in existence. There's a lot of things out there that I think are silly.
Cheeking the pill, right? People put the pill, even if you're watching them take it. This is notorious in psych hospitals. They'll put the pill in their mouth, pretend to swallow, and the minute, the observer leaves the room, they spit it out and toss it. So that's what we call the anosognosia, the lack of insight that they're sick. They don't get it. And they don't get that if I don't swallow this medication the way I'm supposed to every day, I'm going to lose it. And so, they may think, when we go into the thing about the conspiracy, I mean, it's really common for people who are delusional to start thinking the medication is poisoning them.
Right. And there's your conspiracy right there.
There's that out of reality thinking. Yeah, it's a nightmare to manage. And should the parents have been in the position of this, particularly at their age, it's like, oh my God, what a failure.
I've seen I'm sorry, Tony. I've seen a lot of people commenting about, that this is all vanity about him being concerned about weight gain and such. And I want people to step back a little bit. When you're on a medication and you start rapidly gaining weight, your whole life changes. I mean, it's not just I look in the mirror and I see somebody with a puffy face. Your entire life changes. Your clothes aren't fitting. Your body feels different, and it's not good to put on excessive weight. So it is a legitimate concern to say, I am now gaining weight on this medication, and it's concerning to me. So yeah, it sounds vanity and that vein that he's like, I'm gaining weight. I want to do something different. But we need to step back and take a look at what that means for health implications as well.
Right, because the cholesterol goes up
Correct.
and there's certain medications.
Diabetic risk.
People will go up to 400, 450 pounds. And it's not uncommon to try, if somebody's gaining a lot of weight rapidly, it's not uncommon for a doctor to say, we've got some alternative choices here.
Right.
Let's give it a try and see if your body responds better. And so, it's definitely not vanity. I don't swallow that one at all. That's pretty negative.
I want to talk about the TMZ doc that came out citing the David Carmichael case as a father who methodically planned his son's killing while he was in a psychotic state, triggered by a medication change of SSRI.
And that's just one of the things I don't like about that, is that you need a diagnosis even to be admitted. And again, what does that incentivize? It incentivizes people just getting a diagnosis that might not even be accurate, just willy-nilly to get in the door, right? That's what, to me, I think that incentivizes. I mean, ideally, maybe some people get diagnosed with something different after being in an inpatient facility for a while. But again, this is where the money part of the system gets in the way. But as I said before, Rob's situation paying out of pocket, it completely changes that. A lot of this stuff just occurs because of insurance companies. And so the last one here of Mr. Tony.
This is Hidden Killers Live with
Her family has grown used to Nick's alarming behavior. At Conan O'Brien's holiday party the night before the murders, guests were reportedly considering calling 911 after Nick's erratic behavior and a loud argument with his father. But the Reiners, they just apologized and left. They'd been managing crisis after crisis for 30 years. They paid for 18 plus rehab stays, dual diagnosis facilities, the best treatment that money could buy. And still in this second part here, I want to understand the family psychology, how people who love someone can become trapped in a system that ultimately destroys them. Siobhan Scott, psychotherapist and author, is with us. Grown used to it. That's the phrase that TMZ is reporting that was used. I mean, it's haunting. It's understandable for anybody who's been around someone's erratic behavior for long periods of time and can't really find a way out without extreme measures, like just completely separating yourself from the person, whether it be a parent, a family member, a loved one, a spouse. If you don't want to go to that extreme and you're going to try and manage it, you just kind of get used to it. It gets normalized over time, and strangers don't necessarily see it.
Well, time out, people. Would you want me to see me do hidden true crime, where they go over, is it an addict or a psychopath, or watch this video? So one would be going to hidden true crime, addiction or psychopath, or two, continue watching this video. Let me know in the chat.
Because they're seeing the erraticness. You're not, because you're used to it so much. Let's talk about that. I mean, when you get to that point, some may look at it as an...
Okay, good.
Give me a chance to prove it to you.
Oftentimes children or adolescents will want their parents to do it for them. And when their parents can't do it for them, they become angry. And that anger, when parents aren't meeting their needs, in their view, their perception, that unresolved anger becomes rage.
Hello, Hidden Gems. We are back at our table. And that there behind us is our Christmas tree. So that whole idea, I was so proud that I got the Christmas tree up early. It's now up late. So it's going to pretty much be here about half the year if I do my math right. But we have a really important and requested show today. We are going to talk about the case, the very tragic case of Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner, two Hollywood legends who were brutally murdered in their own home. And the person charged in their murders is their own son, Nick Reiner. Nick Reiner has still yet to actually.
And we're watching this video because I think the question's a very interesting question. Addiction or psychopathy? And we'll see if they mention anything about schizophrenia or schizoaffective, but I think these are the right questions to be asking. And asking better questions will yield better answers.
Plead guilty or not guilty. We are still waiting. This has been delayed twice. And his now very famous defense attorney, Alan Jackson, has quit. He stood outside of the courthouse and said, Nick Reiner is not guilty pursuant to California law. Print that.
What we've learned, and you can take this to the bank.
Alan Jackson's like, you know what? In honor of Rob Reiner's memory, I'm going to give a performance for the ages and give a closing press conference that they'll never forget. And Nick Reiner is not guilty. You can print that and put my star right next to Rob Reiner's on the Hollywood Walk of Fame.
Is that pursuant to the laws of this state, pursuant to the law in California, Nick Reiner is not guilty of murder. Print that. Print that. We wish him the very, very best moving forward.
So very, very AJ-like. But while we're waiting for more information on that, we certainly wanted to do what Hidden True Crime does best and talk about some hidden, maybe underlying understanding to this case that has actually affected so many people, including us. It's just such a devastating tragedy. Both Michelle and Rob were activists, and they loved those close to them. We learned recently of Christmas cards that they had sent that people received after their death, and they were very warm and kind. And
so we've had no official word yet as to why Alan Jackson left. My speculation is money. The Jake and Romy, they cut the funds, and the fact that Nick is still being defended by a public defender and not a different attorney, that speaks to the fact that the funds were cut as well. So that's my guess. That's my guess right now.
It just brought home more of the loss. But I see you have an array of papers laid out. You have been thinking of a lot of things, and I'm looking forward to knowing and understanding what you have, your research.
So there's a lot of pieces to this puzzle. Mm-hmm. And I mean, and since the last time we talked about it several weeks ago, I've obviously learned a lot. We've learned a lot. And I think the best way to approach this is to break down the different components. So I kind of mapped out, just to kind of lay out where we're going to be going in the next few weeks. We're just going to cover a segment of this tonight.
Okay.
But I kind of mapped out areas that I felt might be important in terms of understanding some of the hidden motives. Mm-hmm. And I divided those into 6 categories. And I think these all, like a lot of murders, I think they overlap quite a bit. They intersect. And so, but let's just, I'm going to lay these out, and then we'll focus on one of them for today.
Okay.
But so these are the questions I have about Nick Reiner based on what we know. The first question I have is, and I think is probably related to this case, has to do with personality disorders. Mm-hmm. So the first question I would have is, does Nick Reiner seem to have, or might he have, a personality disorder?
That's a right question to ask. I've heard so few people ask this question. And I would say a lot of his behaviors point in that direction. And to me, they point in that direction probably even more even than the schizo direction, the schizoaffective direction, because you look at the enviness of being envious of others, the grandiosity, the lack of empathy, the entitlement, being spoiled rotten. All of that speaks to the personality disordered issue.
People have wondered.
There is a lot of talk, for example, about problems Nick Reiner had as a child in terms of violent outbursts, in terms of a temper, in terms of impulsivity. And so, right, that type of behavior, although I don't have enough evidence from his childhood, I don't know enough about it. Many people, many sources, neighbors even, have talked about how, in many ways, he carried that behavior forward into adulthood.
Yeah.
So it raises issues, certainly, I think, about personality disorders. And we'll be talking more about that a little bit today in terms of how personality disorders intersect potentially with schizophrenia.
There is an alleged diagnosis or report of schizophrenia. We cannot.
Yeah.
Nobody can necessarily confirm that because we haven't seen the medical records, but that has certainly been stated by insider sources to media.
And so that's the second area that's going to be relevant to this case as we talk about it more and more is mental illness. And one of the components of mental illness is schizophrenia. And so that's what I'll focus on today. But I want to kind of lay out the pieces. So also depression. I know from reading some articles and listening to people talk about some of his past, and I can't confirm this, by the way. None of this is all based.
And again, all of these things can be true. You can be an addict with a personality disorder, with schizoaffective disorder. They're not all mutually exclusive. You can have all, which makes it even trickier, right? But again, my order of operations would be addiction first, then work on something that helps you to become a better person. And when you do those two things, I think you'll just be more likely to get the other things to fall in line.
Based on second-hand sources like
insider sources that the media is sharing with us.
The Daily Mail, Page 6, the New York Times has some pieces that are relevant. The Hollywood Reporter, Variety, like all of these sources have been very helpful, but we haven't confirmed them.
And TMZ is the one that that relayed the schizophrenia.
Also a shout out to Billy Bush, who did an amazing Access Hollywood interview in 2015 with Nick and Rob when the movie Being Charlie was released, and he actually just played it recently, and that has some really fascinating moments.
Okay.
We're going to be talking about Flossom Talk.
Okay.
So that she had a very.
I think the issue with doing the mental health first is the addictions are going to make it that much harder to fight to do anything for the mental health. I think no matter what method you choose, there's going to be some discomfort. And that's going to be the thing you can't be too concerned about. Like there's going to be discomfort with any growth. There's going to be the uncomfortable feeling of change, right? And just because you feel uncomfortable doesn't mean it's the uncomfortable feeling of maybe something that's not good for you or your boundaries being crossed. So again, it can be a combination, right? You at least want to be clean for like a very little bit so there's not any brutal interactions between a psych med and whatever addiction like you're struggling with, right?
Helpful insight in terms of potential postpartum depression with Michelle around the time that Nick was born or when he was a baby. So those are all going to be relevant, right? I mean, people throw these pieces out, and now it's our job to try to connect them, or it's my job to try to connect them. So the mental health issues, the ones that seem the most prominent here would be schizophrenia. And so I say schizophrenia because TMZ released a story that was based supposedly on reliable sources, stating essentially that in the weeks leading up to these murders, that I'm going to quote here, that Nick was, quote, out of his head, according to one of the sources, that several people apparently noticed changes in Nick's behavior, and this was allegedly related to changes in his medication for schizophrenia. So the presumption is that Nick had a diagnosis of schizophrenia.
Mm-hmm.
He was being medicated, or he was taking, presumably he was taking antipsychotics. And then there was some adjustment to those medications in, let's say, 2 to 4 weeks prior to the murders. And these.
So someone in the chat's asking for like bully Billy Bush. I really don't know much about him besides the one interview he did with Alan Jackson.
The adjustments weren't working effectively, and that Nick was becoming more aggressive and he was acting out. And so the story is that the presumption here is that the medication adjustments had something to do with the violence that was the murders and the violence that was committed.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the story that TMZ released. And, you know, we'll talk about this in a minute, because it's worth asking who released that information.
Yeah.
And why they released that information.
Yeah.
So, but we'll get to that in a minute. But depression, I think, also factors into this in the sense that there's at least several sources that are saying that Nick was taking antidepressants when he was in some of the treatment facilities, which would seem to point in the direction of possible depression. So I think that makes sense, given what we know about Nick and given some of his struggles. It makes sense that there's some depression. I mean, he never really worked for years.
Yeah. Didn't seem super focused on goals.
Lacked focus, right? I mean, he
suffered from homelessness.
Somebody that was apparently a classmate of Nick's told the Daily Mail that he had a lot of shame, that he kind of labored under the weight of the Reiner family and the expectations. We talked about that last time, but I think that's a big part of this puzzle.
Makes sense.
And so why would depression come into play? Well, shame is closely related to self-esteem. And if you're struggling with self-esteem, that's one of the possible criteria for depression.
Okay.
So I think depression comes into play. The next element that I think is really relevant here, and I haven't seen anybody really focus on this, is the Reiner family culture.
So I was saying about depression, I mean, for the very most part, most people struggling with addiction will also experience some depression as well. I can think of very few instances where that's not the case. Even Frank Sinatra, right? You think about Frank Sinatra, he's well known for being like the happy-go-lucky, jolly drunk. But you read between the lines there, and he said he's prone to periods of melancholy, which, of course, when you're drinking a bottle of Jack Daniels a day, how can you be surprised if you experience a little bit of melancholy and depressive phases? The same thing with Winston Churchill. He would have his breakfast of champions, like a whiskey or champagne for breakfast, and he would have this black dog depression, is what he would call it.
It's a bit of a mystery. A lot of people have been talking about it, but it is, yeah.
Oh.
A quick message from today's sponsor, the ASPCA Health Insurance Program.
Maybe early next week, we'll be talking about other elements of this murder, I think. And of course, we learn more all the time, so that'll help us. But one thing and just giving an overview of this family culture, one thing that really comes up a lot is how kind and loving.
My two favorite Frank Sinatra quotes. One would be, "The best revenge is massive success." And then my other one is, "Alcohol may be man's worst enemy, but the Bible says to love your enemy."
This family was.
Yeah, it does.
People talk all the time about that.
It comes up again and again.
And yet when you throw into the mix Nick and his dysfunctions and his substance abuse, that is the sort of thing that really can put a family culture on edge, or they can really disrupt a family culture. In fact, in one of the more interesting interviews that Rob gave to ABC News early on in 2016 when they were releasing Being Charlie, this is a quote from Rob. He said, "These problems," meaning addiction problems, quote, "these problems affect the whole family. It's a living system. It's affected what happened to his mother and me." In other words, Rob is astute enough to recognize that.
Yes, addiction is absolutely a family thing, because name me any family that has an addict in it, that they're all living together under one roof, and it's not impacting every person in the family. Like the person that has the addiction, a lot of times the people their lives will revolve around that person. And this is the proper use of the term codependent, by the way. They'll say you're codependent on the substance that the addict is using. Why do they say this? Because your whole life is revolving around that one person's addiction. So it's absolutely a family thing. And if you unpack some of it, you probably figure out some things that Rob and Michelle probably could have done better. That doesn't mean it's their fault, but there's things everyone can do better. That's just part of being human.
This whole family was shaken by his addiction, and it really had a tremendous impact on the whole system. And so the family culture, the Reiner family culture, was in many ways disrupted or changed by Nick's addiction. And, again, like, I'm just going to scratch the surface here, but sometimes addicts, they demand that, right? That sometimes addicts are so attention seeking that one of their implicit goals is to really command or demand attention from the system so that they become the key player. That some of it becomes a power struggle.
And again, this is where it can overlap, certainly, where addiction can seem to overlap with narcissism sometimes, right? If it's all about attention, power struggle, control, I mean, what does that sound like? Now, is everyone that's struggling with addiction also struggling with narcissism? No, but there is a fair amount. There's a fair amount of people that do struggle with both, probably. And they also say 12-step programs have actually been proven to help narcissism as well. And I would say the reason for that is it addresses the same problems a narcissistic person has.
The addict, knowingly or unknowingly, often it's unknowingly, often it's unconscious, they act out so that they're always being validated. They're always being right. They become the focus of attention in the family. And so so think about that for a minute. No matter how famous.
Deb's like, these two have very stiff faces. And I would say, if I was like Viagra or Cialis, I would say, this product will make you as stiff as these two faces.
The Reiners are, that Rob is, that his father was, right? That in some ways, none of that matters if you have this child with this severe problem that's constantly absorbing all your energy and all your attention and all your focus. Then guess who becomes the real center of the family?
Yeah, the child.
Right. And so I don't think this is conscious, by the way. I think this is something that's happening below. Again, this is hidden. We're the Hidden True Crime Podcast. That what's hidden here is that this family system revolves around Nick's dysfunction, whether they like it or not. And I think that they're trying, this family really tries to normalize this situation, but I don't think they ever succeed. Clearly they don't succeed because the end result of this is murder. So you have a really unique situation, and that brings in another component of the family culture, and that is that this is a Hollywood culture. So I have a really interesting quote from I have a really interesting quote from a yoga instructor who her name is Ilana Zabel, and she used to visit the home all the time to give private yoga lessons to the Reiners, which, you're dealing with a Hollywood family when the yoga instructor comes to your house to get
Beautiful. Beautiful.
if you want to do yoga, you're hitting the road and
That's awesome.
going to the local gym, right? But with the Reiners, they get yoga on demand. So
Respect.
that's
Yeah.
great. Yeah, respect. Exactly. So she made a comment about this to one of the media outlets. And here, I'm going to read what she said. She said, quote, "There's also the fact that the Reiners live in Hollywood. I have witnessed the children of Hollywood personalities have a really different..."
I've never seen this one before. Look at Rob Reiner. Rob Reiner's looked like he's been the same age for like 20 years. I guess that's Michelle. Jake. Nick. I mean, Rob Reiner's one of those guys. Like, where's another example? Larry David. Larry David's an example of somebody has looked like he's been old for a long time. Morgan Freeman, I think he's another example of that.
Difficult time because they are living in a fantasy world.
Huh.
The parents are prioritizing many things, including them, but there's often a perception of negligence. She suggested or implied that she believed that maybe Nick had ADHD. It turns out that Ilana Zabel, by the way, has a degree in child development, and she's got some familiarity with children and their mental health issues. And so she speculated that she believed he might have ADHD. She also, by the way, I should mention, talked about a moment or several moments when she was teaching yoga to the family and Nick was younger. He was like 11-ish, let's say 11 to 13-ish. And she would come over and Nick would have these tantrums.
Yeah. Is she the one that wrote the book?
She's the one who wrote the book.
Okay.
Yeah. So, as a matter of fact, now that we're on this topic, she wrote a book in 2005 called A Chair in the Air. The book was an attempt for her to process part of her experiences working with the Reiners in the early 2000s when she would come over to their home. She's reported that Nick would regularly interrupt their private yoga classes with screaming outbursts that last upward of 20 minutes.
And this is, I guess, the yoga teacher. And we went over this before in a previous video, but this is what he would do. And what does this sound like to you? Could it be the beginnings of narcissism, ADHD, undiagnosed on the spectrum, or just a spoiled brat? Let's hear it.
This is a quote from her book. So that was according to the Daily Mail. She said, quote, Nicky. So she names him in the book. Nicky is full of big feelings and even bigger energy. So big, in fact, that one day his excitement accidentally sends a vase flying across the room. I presume that's an actual experience for her, that Nick threw a vase across the room. Maybe he didn't, but...
Accidentally throw a vase across the room? I don't know about that framing. Is he very intentionally, in a temper tantrum, threw a vase across the room?
It sounds like it. She has said
in the
this
book.
book is about him and his big energy and trying to process it. The character's name is Nikki.
So what's interesting about that is you have this young child, Nick Reiner, who already is disrupting this family culture. And we'll talk more about this in detail later, but she speculates that this is potentially ADHD. But I think there's other options here. This could be...
I would agree that it could be other things. I mean, ADHD can seem like a catch-all for some people, but I think there could be deeper things going on.
Something like oppositional defiant disorder, perhaps.
ODD.
ODD. It could be. Again, I don't know.
I've wondered that.
I
I've
don't
wondered
know.
that. I was going to ask you that. So, okay. possibility. We don't know.
It could even be, so in schizophrenia, there's something called the prodromal phase. And that is so in schizophrenia, you have the prodromal phase, and then you have the acute phases, which is when symptoms are active. But before symptoms are active, you have this prodromal phase. This could be the beginning of signs of schizophrenia. That you could have a child that's beginning to lose some contact with reality. It would be a little unusual at 11, but I don't have the exact dates here, but that might be more common around, that you might see that more around the age of like 14, 15-ish. So I've worked with some adolescents that.
So here's the $1 million question though. If there's mental health going on, mood disorders, at what point are you no longer accountable for yourself? Is there a point? Are you always accountable for yourself? And if you are always accountable for yourself, it's like, well, then it can't be an excuse then for your behavior, can it? If the law is not going to treat it as an excuse, so why should we in other areas?
At 14 and 15 are starting to show some early signs of schizophrenia. And it's very hard to recognize, by the way, because you're not anticipating that a 14 or a 15-year-old is going to have some loss of contact with reality.
Right.
And by the way, just to define schizophrenia quickly, I would characterize it as severe mental illness that impacts everything we do. So it impacts the brain in terms of thinking, thoughts, feelings, behaviors. And the biggest characteristic of schizophrenia, to put it simply, is that it's the beginning of a loss of contact with reality.
But here's the thing about that, though. I've known people that have been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and for the most part, their symptoms were managed with antipsychotics or a mood stabilizer, mostly antipsychotics, though. And so, to me, if you're med compliant, once you figure out what you're dealing with, I think you can live a manageable life and a productive life. The issue becomes if you go off the rails and do addictions, then it's a free for all. Then you don't know what's going to happen.
Jeez. Yeah. That's so sad when you put it that way, but that's exactly what it is.
Right. And if you think about, you're 15 years old, right? And you're trying to find your way in the world. You're trying to define your identity. And all of a sudden you're waking up and the world is a little bit off. Your thoughts you're losing a little bit of contact with what you think is real. And I don't mean you're having like full-blown hallucinations, but you're not fitting your thoughts with what you're observing. Your perceptions are slightly skewed.
Yeah.
And that's very disorienting, right? You can imagine how every adolescent is really trying to find their way, and they're trying to define their identity, and they're trying to separate from their family. And all of a sudden you're 14, 15, 16, and you're having trouble just making sense of basic things in life. Right. It becomes very, very problematic and very difficult. And so it's not hard to imagine in that scenario that a child or an adolescent that's beginning to lose contact with reality would turn to drugs. And that, by the way, is roughly the time when Nick Reiner starts using drugs as 14, 15 years old. He ends up in his first treatment facility at 15.
Yeah.
Because he's smoking marijuana, roughly at 14-ish. And his parents find out and they send him to a treatment facility. So could this be prodromal schizophrenia that he's self-medicating
Possibly.
to solve, right?
It sounds like it, the way you just explained it. Yeah.
It could be. It's
also to cope with shame or anxiety.
So Ty, I did hear this. I heard that the Reiners made a friend with someone convicted of murder. I don't know if this was the person that was sentenced to death or not, but I did hear this was a thing. And they also spoke to Jake and Romy too. And they talked to this person even after Rob and Michelle were killed. So again, I think Rob and Michelle were living their values with that. I guess because Rob was a big advocate of, believe it or not, every violent criminal had a terrible childhood. Now, granted, I don't agree with Rob on that. But if that was true, then wouldn't that be ironic for Rob to say that and then have this happen? But I don't believe that. I don't believe that what Rob said. And I think even Michael McKee in this other case, I think he's another example of proving Rob to be not correct about that. So he was adopted, and granted, there can be abuse in adoptive situations, of course, but the guy was a surgeon. I think his issue was simply more personality disorder stuff, psychopathic stuff, not as much from childhood trauma. But what do I think about them doing that? I mean, hey, they can do what they want.
Or something as big as schizophrenia.
Yeah, and also my point. I'm going to bring this back to the Hollywood family and how Alana basically tells us that Hollywood families are sort of out of touch, that they live in a fantasy world, right? And so I think that's part of the problem here too. This is a family culture that exists in its own ecosystem of Hollywood.
Yeah.
Right. Could you imagine growing up with all these famous Hollywood people coming in and out of your home all the time?
Yeah.
Conan O'Brien just happens to drop by.
And I will say, when you grew up in Hollywood, you are living in a bubble. You're living in a different world where there's probably a baseline level of entitlement, grandiosity, narcissistic traits. It's probably your normal in that case. People who feel like they're better than others, people being attention seeking. I think that's one of the issues of Hollywood, right? And Eva mentioned in the chat, a doctor told her that if you have a TBI, traumatic brain injury, medications might be less likely to work. And that wouldn't surprise me. Yours truly has had several concussions, and I've wondered what that has done to me. I really don't know. But I'll put it this way. It probably doesn't help. It doesn't help anything. That's for sure. It doesn't help your brain's functioning.
Say, right? Like, or whoever, right? I mean, I use him because he was the one that had the party, but
yeah. Well, it's interesting you actually say that too, because I've actually wondered a lot about how Nick allegedly at this party was confronting people saying, "Are you famous? Are you famous? Are you famous?"
Yeah.
I actually found that very telling because it would sort of imply this sort of fantasy world of everybody around him being uber successful, famous, a celebrity, which was essentially his entire orbit, his world.
I think to me it indicates that, right? I think that.
So Nick kind of reminds me of two people. One, Fredo from The Godfather, when he wanted to become his own man and he was pissed that his father, Vito Corleone, passed him over and made Michael the head of the family. Very envious, very bitter, very resentful that happened. I get the same kind of energy from Nick, where he wanted the attention. He wanted to be special in his own right, but he always felt like he was overshadowed by his dad, Rob, and his grandfather. And granted, not everyone can be great, right? So that is, in a way, it can be a tough thing to grow into. Now, granted, there's a lot of benefits and privileges, but no situation is going to be all good. The other thing it reminded me of was Gladiator. So Marcus Aurelius' son, what was his name? Joaquin Phoenix's character. I can't remember. But his character traits kind of reminded me of that same like petulant, where Marcus Aurelius was like, or he said to his dad, "You value all these things that Maximus has, but I don't have." And what is that? Kind of like a envious, bitter, resentful mentality to have. Envious of Maximus, a little bit of a victim routine.
I agree. That's part of it, but I think it also indicates that he's very concerned about status. That he's asking if people are famous, but he's going in there with kind of this implicit pecking order. right, of the world and of the party. And I think that speaks to, that's exactly the point I want to make, is that when you grow up in this kind of sheltered Hollywood ecosystem.
So what does a pecking order speak to? Speaks to hierarchical thinking. Hierarchical thinking is how narcissists think. They rank order people in the hierarchy that they find most important. If you go back in time and you watch my interview with Jacob, the nameless narcissist from a couple years ago, he's actually become a very famous narcissist since then. But he talks about that. And they have these rank order hierarchical thinking. And it sounds like Nick had that too. He was up, say, my dad and granddad were better than me. He's ranking them in his mind. Because if he's not able to become better in his own mind, he's always going to be less than them. And that really matters to him, especially when you have a grandiose sense of self and you're losing. This is also why narcissistic people are very competitive a lot of times as well. They hate to lose.
Some that Alana Zabel says is all based on fantasy. I mean, they're in the business of creating fantasy and selling fantasy, right? What happens is, I think you develop a very distorted view of the world.
Yeah.
And you develop very distorted expectations. And I think in the Reiner family, when you have two generations of massive success, right, those expectations must be enormous.
Yeah.
And in fact, some friends of Nick have talked about that they believe that he was never able to get out from under the weight of all those expectations. And it just absolutely buried him. That he couldn't find his voice. He couldn't find his identity. He was filled with shame because he couldn't meet expectations. And so I think that's a big part of this story as well. But if you think about that, if you think about how distorted, potentially how distorted your perception of the world would be because you grow up in this Hollywood fantasy world, right? And now,
yeah, this sort of bubble, maybe.
This bubble.
'Cause it's not a fantasy to them; it's real to them.
No, yeah, no, I know it's a business. I mean, I'm not saying that everyone.
But this sort of bubble that the rest of the world isn't necessarily accustomed to.
Right, exactly. You know, you're right. It's atypical in the sense that very few people do it.
And that's a very good point, all things. Jake and Romy, for all we know, from what we can tell, they didn't struggle with this. Which is why we say narcissism, more of a genetic lottery, honestly. Just because your parents are something doesn't mean every one of your kids will be something. And even if your parents aren't something, doesn't mean your kids can't be that something. So, and I think this family perhaps could be proof of that. Now, again, Rob, like what would Rob be? I don't get, like, I bet you Rob had an ego. I don't really get full-blown narky vibes from him, but I have no doubts that he probably had an ego for sure, just as a part of being worth hundreds of millions, etc.
Very few people have the talent and the ability to make movies, right?
Yeah.
I'm not denigrating it.
No.
The people who do it are.
It's just a very small percentage.
It's a small percentage. And so, but here's my point is that if you see this world as being somewhat distorted from the real world,
mm-hmm.
and you're in this world and all of a sudden you're prodromal schizophrenic or you're having some symptoms of schizophrenia, imagine how confusing that must be.
Yes.
Right? You're in a distorted world and now your perceptions of that world are becoming even more distorted.
That's true. That makes sense. All right. I see where you're going.
So I think that makes it doubly hard for him to negotiate this world in a way that really makes sense, or that, you know, I was going to say rational. I don't know if that's quite the right word, but in a way that adds up to Nick Reiner.
Yeah.
And so I think these are all elements that are going to make it harder for Nick to kind of negotiate this world, right? And there's another part of the family culture, and again, we'll talk about this in a little more depth, but I just want to touch on it now, is I think this is a really important point that nobody's talking about in the Reiner case.
I'm done with skin.
And no, I definitely don't think everyone's a narcissist. Like I said, I don't think Rob Reiner is.
And that is that we hear constantly about this issue of kindness and how kind Rob Reiner is and how kind Michelle, right? They
over and over again.
They send Christmas cards to or holiday
Everyone
cards.
in their lives.
Everyone in their life, like
even including their trainers and
everyone. Yeah. Right. They're very thoughtful. And I want to make it so what's important about this is that you can have a family system that has kindness at its foundation. Let's say the foundation of the family system is kindness, and that's great.
And acceptance.
And acceptance and understanding and love and support. Here's the problem.
Okay.
Most people listening to this think, well, that's great. Right? Kindness and love are enough to solve any problem, right?
Yeah.
But that's not quite true, because so
it's a good question, Elizabeth. Elizabeth asks, how did Rob have any time to be a present father when he's always working? Well, here's the thing. I don't always think it's about the amount of time. It's more about the quality of time. I'd say it's better to be 100% present, but there only like half the time, as opposed to 100% there, but not really present. I think it's the quality of the time that means a lot more. Because somebody can have a narcissistic father that's always there, but is there a connection? Is there emotional safety? I would say not. So it's not the only thing that matters. I think the quality of the connection and time when it's spent, that's what matters to me.
I want to say is that it's important not to equate kindness with connection. That I think this is a family system that has an inordinate amount.
This guy knew what I was going to say. So what I would say, that's a good way to put it. Kindness and connection are not the same thing. And someone can be kind, but that doesn't mean you're connecting with that person. And I think Rob and Nick's relationship kind of proved that. I think Rob was trying to be kind, but it was not really hitting home. And you can tell that by how Nick was acting in those interviews, how Nick was acting in the Dopey podcast, and then ultimately what he ended up doing. Right? Where is the connection? There wasn't one. And granted, Nick even acknowledged that his dad tried to help him a lot too. It didn't prevent him from seeing it like that much differently though. Like it didn't help the connection.
Amount of kindness, but I don't know. And again, I'm speculating here. I don't know if this is a family system that's connected.
Okay.
And the reason I say that is because if you go back and look at these interviews between Rob and Nick, and they did a lot of them for Being Charlie. So this was a long time ago. This was a decade ago. The movie comes out in 2016. They're on this tour in 2015-16.
And Being Charlie is the movie that...
and this connection thing is something I've talked about in a bunch of my breakdowns of this topic, is that without the connection, Rob was trying, but he just wasn't on the same page as Nick. And maybe his social calibration, Rob's, he wasn't able to see it. Like there are times maybe when he thought he was connecting, but he really wasn't. And why might he think that? Because Nick might have been going along to get along, placating a little bit. But even so, in those interviews, it didn't even seem like he was going along to get along that much. He was really being passive aggressive, going out of his way to disagree with him, to try to make him look silly, his dad. So I could see it, but maybe not everyone can.
It was inspired by Nick's addiction and his relationship with his father, correct?
Yeah, it's semi-autobiographical.
And that's a good question. We hear nothing about Michelle's connection with Nick, his mother. Have you heard anything? I haven't heard anything. But she's also was killed too. So What does that lead you to believe? Couldn't have been much better of a connection, I guess, right?
And I'm not going to get, we're not going to have time to get into all that because I'm just touching on this issue. We will get into it later in another episode.
Right.
We'll really dig into that, and we'll talk about the movie and
you've watched
more
the
about the
show.
family culture. But I think the family culture is really probably one of the key pieces to understanding this murder.
Okay.
So, but I want to touch on this because I want to throw it out there for people to think about because it's so important that if you look at these interviews, there are most of the time, or a lot of the time, Rob and Nick are very disconnected in terms of little things like this. Like you and I, people complain because I don't
It's almost like he watched my shows about this.
look at the camera. So,
And then, well, it's okay. They complain that I look at it too much. Like I'm looking at myself. I'm like, I'm just trying,
You're
as you
trying-
say, to connect.
you're trying to get one of us to look at the camera.
And that's true.
So-
And I'm also trying to be like, lead him over. Yeah. Anyway, but yes, you
So,
do
but-
not
but-
look at the camera.
But my point is, if for me as a psychologist, I'm in the business of connection. So like for me, it would be natural to turn to you like this and look at you, right?
Yeah.
I put my hand on you, like, right? It's like, if I'm going to connect with someone, I'm going to do it this way. Right. And so it's awkward for me to look in the camera and try to feel connected to you because you're here. Right. And I want to look at you. And so, but there's a point here.
Okay.
That in some of these interviews, Rob Reiner puts up his leg.
Like that. Okay.
He's on a couch, but he puts his leg up to like shield himself from Nick.
Huh.
And he goes like this. There's one interview where the whole interview, he's kind of going like this and turning away from Nick.
I kind of do that too, though, because
Yeah,
it's comfy.
But there's a difference between doing this and going like this, right?
Okay. Huh. So you're watching like the full,
I'm watching the
connection.
psychologists call this process. So when I work with my students, what I don't do, I take it back. What I do some of the time is I listen to what we call content, which is, in other words, content is the subject of what people are discussing.
Mm-hmm.
Where content is the topic of schizophrenia or mental illness, right? But process is what goes on between us.
Yeah.
Process is the nonverbals and the unspoken elements of what's occurring in the room.
Yeah.
So process in many ways is more telling. And this, by the way, is not body language. It's different. Process is more direct. That like body language is more speculative than process. Process is based on evidence. So if I'm trying to connect with you and I'm shying away from you and I'm doing that.
It's
right,
uncomfortable. I'm
right,
already like, get
right,
back. I'm like, what
right.
are you doing?
right.
Come back. Yeah.
Then I'm going to notice in that process that there's something going on, right? Like I'm going to ask if one of my students is in a room with a client and the client is really uncomfortable talking about certain topics or is not making eye contact, right? If there appears to be a clear disconnect, then that's something I want to talk about.
Okay.
Why is the client feeling that disconnect, right? What's the process happening in that room? And
an Egyptian, I agree. I don't think Nick did like his dad. I think begrudgingly he acknowledged at times how much Rob was trying to help him. But for the most part, look at those interviews. Did it seem like he liked his dad? He certainly didn't have a connection, but it also didn't even seem like he liked him. It seemed like he outright was resentful of him, envious of him, and just overall didn't like him. That's what I would say. And again, I don't know what it was like with his mother. Someone said in the chat that the mother was the peacemaker. So I don't know if you'd consider that an enabler in this case, but whatever it was, didn't go too well.
If you pay attention, and we'll talk again, we'll talk about this in more depth in our future episodes, but the process between Nick and Rob, not always, but quite often, feels strained. It feels like there's a disconnect. And even though Rob
And I would say to him, it seems like Helen Keller and Ray Charles know that too.
is super kind, and he's trying to connect to Nick, it doesn't seem to work.
Yeah.
Nick seems to want to resist it. That's the other thing about Nick, by the way. Nick tends to be pretty shut down. He's a little flat. That's a term you and I use all the time. That people that are depressed don't have much affect. And Nick often comes across, he doesn't come across as particularly expressive or particularly emotive, right? He comes across as a bit.
So the issue with how they're even speaking here, it's like he's talking at her. And like, where's their connection? It's like, where's their conversation here? She's just like giving a presentation and she's here. But there's not much of like a conversing.
Flat, a bit depressed, a bit disconnected, which, by the way, one of the symptoms or one of the elements of schizophrenia is it's called the negative symptom of schizophrenia, which is restricted affect.
Well, I know what affect is. What does it restricted mean?
Restricted means that there's almost no show of emotion, that your emotion is completely
zero
shut.
affect.
There's
Flat?
It's a little more than flat. Flat affect would be more depression. Schizophrenia would be more extreme.
Okay.
Now, I don't know. I mean, I'd have to meet with Nick Reiner in a room and like for some period of time to really determine whether his affect is in fact consistent with the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. So I can't say that from watching interviews 10 years ago. That wouldn't be accurate.
Yeah.
But I can say that it may not be flat affect. It might be something more like oppositionality. In other words, Nick doesn't want to connect with his father.
That's what
He's resisting connection.
Right.
And so his father senses that, and his father is like, doing this, right? Like
simply because he connects it, simply because he senses it.
Nick senses it. He doesn't want.
Rob senses it.
Rob senses it, again, probably unconsciously. Rob's been trying to find this connection with his son for years. Nick's not going to give that to him.
Yeah.
Nick's not going to allow that, because if Nick lets him in fully, then in some ways, if you think about addiction is partly a power struggle between father and son in this case, or father and mother. But let's say father and son in particular. The reason I mentioned that, by the way, is because in the Access Hollywood interview with Billy Bush, there's a point where Nick actually says, quite openly, he says in front of his father, he says, I feel more connected to my mother because she's more emotional.
Huh. That's interesting.
That's not the exact quote. I think I have the
paraphrased.
I think I have the exact quote somewhere. Let's see here. Yeah, here we go. He says, quote, and this is the Billy Bush interview, quote, it was comforting to talk to her because she was a little more in touch with her emotions and how she felt about it. And he, Rob, was trying to follow orders.
What about mom? I didn't go to either of them because neither of them believed a word I said, but it was sort of like comforting to talk to her because she was a little bit more in touch with her emotions and how she felt about it. And he was sort of trying to, follow orders, I guess.
You went to, how many times did you go to rehab? You said, is it 18 times?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
But it had to come from you. So what was rock bottom?
There wasn't one. It's all rock bottom. It all sucked.
When did you, what made you finally make it not a 19th?
I got just sick of it. I mean, it's hard to believe that you wouldn't get sick after 5 of them, but I mean, after 18, I was like, okay, I'm pretty bored of this. It wasn't like I want to go back to rehab. I was like, I'm sick of this cycle, this using drugs, it being so temporary, the fix, then going back into a place for months on end, then getting out and just, rinse,
this
wash,
being
repeat.
my life.
Yeah.
Do you believe, and they'll tell you, you're gonna die if you continue on this way? Do you think you would die, or did you?
Yeah.
And honestly, that part adds up to me from Nick too. He's basically saying, I was like sick and tired of being sick and tired, and that actually helped me. And I think for a lot of people with addiction stuff, that is true. Like there's a version of a bottom that they get. Now people will push back on that and say, oh, it's not necessary to bottom out. I would say, yeah, it's not necessary, but it just so happens to be necessary apparently for many people.
Yeah.
Still feel invincible.
No, I mean, of course, there's that level of feeling that way, but I was, the rate I was going was probably not great. Gonna end up great.
Did you feel like, did you ever get close?
Yeah.
And what he's talking about is their arguments and their disputes over rehab. And he's saying that Rob, his father, was strictly focused on adhering to the treatment facility's orders, and the mother was more concerned about his emotions about being in treatment.
Can I keep reading that? Can I read it again?
Well, yeah.
It says,
right here.
Oh, right here? Right here.
No, here.
It was comforting to talk to her because she was a little more in touch with her emotions and how she felt about it. And he, meaning Rob, was trying to follow orders. And then that, did you read that too, though?
No, not yet.
Oh, sorry. That's okay. That's what caught my eye.
So let's read between the lines there. So he's saying Rob's not in touch with his emotions. What does that sound like? Maybe someone who's a little more callous. And here's the other thing, though. Like when you're that big of a person in Hollywood and have created movies, I do think you get kind of disconnected sometimes from yourself even. And you're no longer as sensitive as a person. And like you're in that business mode, money in business. I think it does something to you. It's very rare that it doesn't seem to do something to people. But I think that's what he's talking about there. Like something happened to his dad. A little bit, not shallow, but just not, maybe that old school version of masculinity, maybe. The strong and silent type kind of thing. And you know, it also speaks to that when Stephen King was watching Stand By Me when Rob gave him a private screening of it. Stephen King was so touched by it that he gave Rob Reiner a hug. And Stephen King said he seemed like the kind of guy that wasn't used to getting hugs. And I was like, oh, what does that speak to? Kind of what Nick is talking about here.
Okay, well, wait.
So I'm gonna throw that out there because I want to emphasize this point that and also when we're talking about connection, let's go back to this issue about postpartum depression that I watched on Fossum Talk.
Okay, that's an interesting possibility.
The somebody who worked for the Reiners believed or said, told her, a source told her that Michelle suffered from postpartum depression, and it was quite obvious, and I think she was somewhat open about it. So that raises the issue of, so that's another part of this puzzle, and that's attachment. So something we talk about all the time with criminals is their struggles to develop what we call secure attachments.
I was wondering about attachment with Nick, especially if you say he resisted connecting to his dad.
Well, in fact, in one of the interviews that he gives around Being Charlie, the movie, he says in front of his dad, he says, I'm going to get the quote a little bit wrong. I'll have to go back and get the exact quote.
Okay.
But he says something like, I never felt like I bonded with my father.
To me, that would be attachment.
Attachment. But it also gets to this issue of connection. So if you think of attachment and connection as being related, which they are, if you're Nick Reiner and you have a mother who has postpartum depression,
not her fault.
Not her fault. It could be, and there's different levels of postpartum depression, by the way. You and I know that a lot of filicides occur when there's postpartum psychosis, right? But postpartum depression would be a lesser version of postpartum problems. And then there's something which is even less problematic than postpartum depression, and that's just the baby blues. So the baby blues are just some hormonal right? Aftershocks from giving birth.
Oh,
that,
yeah.
that like 50%, I forget the exact.
I mean, and that's something to keep in mind here too, right? I say Rob is trying to connect, but you can't connect with someone that's unwilling to connect. Right? Now, but granted, each person can only work on their own side of it. Rob can only work on his side of it and how he tries to connect and how he tries to communicate with his son. And then Nick, he has to even be open to do it. You can't connect with anyone who's not willing, usually, right? It's just not going to happen. You have to finally like open and say, okay, we'll be real here. But if they're not going to be real, you're banging your head up against a wall.
Exact number now, but a lot of women experience that.
Yeah.
And then postpartum depression is roughly 20 to 25%. And then postpartum psychosis, you go down to like 5% or less. But women that experience postpartum depression, so let's say it's that, let's say it's more than the baby blues, which it sounds like it was, but not psychotic, not psychosis. They have a much harder time developing secure attachments with their babies. And so it's highly possible that Nick Reiner, just by virtue of the fact that he was unlucky and he was, let's presume that Romy and Jake both
attached.
So he's going to try to say that his mother had postpartum depression and then Nick doesn't attach to her properly and that caused some of the rest of this. I don't know if I buy that. I think back in the day, they would attribute more things to the environment. And in this case, your mother having postpartum depression. I think back in the day, what they would do is they would blame more things on parenting in the mother than was warranted. But I think they're learning, no, that's not really, like there's a big genetic component to a lot of this stuff. And you can't just blame postpartum depression or the mother for the kid's behavior. Not fair.
Differently because their mother, but because Michelle was not suffering.
Well, she was in a better place.
She was in a better place. And she was more responsive to those children than she was to Nick.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And again, I'm not saying that this explains all of it, but it's interesting.
It's an interesting element to explore.
I say it's interesting, but to me, it doesn't really explain any of it.
Was there an attachment issue because of the circumstances?
Right. And then if you look at this issue around, Rob and Nick feeling that he didn't bond with his father, he says this in front of his father. He says, I never felt like I've developed a bond with you.
And I shouldn't say it explains none of it. I should say it explains very little because the environment doesn't have no impact, right? It does have some. I just think people have overblown it in the past.
You can go back there, by the way. So let's consider that for a minute. You can go back there to Rob's relationship with his father, Carl. And Carl is this uber successful comedian and producer and director in Hollywood. And Rob 3 months before the murders, Rob was on a podcast. He was on the Fresh Air podcast with Terry Gross. And he says quite openly to her, this, Fresh Air is an NPR podcast. It used to be.
Correct, Egyptian. I think he was born with some of this stuff, whether it was the personality disorder, schizophrenia, and then that's the hand he was dealt. Much less to do with a mother's postpartum depression or if Rob was absent as a father even, right? And I don't know what his schedule was. I don't know what his movie making schedule was as a kid, right? If I had to guess, there were some times when he wasn't there at all. And then there's other times when he was more there. But I don't know that. I don't know that for sure. That's just a guess.
A top podcast. He tells Terry Gross quite openly, he said, quote, I felt that my father didn't love me or understand me.
I felt that my father didn't, love me or understand me. And it was the character of Gordy that expressed those things. And the film was a combination of nostalgia, emotion, and a lot of humor. And it was a real reflection of my personality. It was an extension, really, of my sensibility. And when it became successful, I said, oh, okay, I can go in the direction that I want to go in and not feel like I have to, mirror everything my father has done up till then.
You just said you felt like your father didn't love or understand you when you were growing up, but you've also talked about how much you loved your father and wanted to be like him. You even wanted to take on his name at some point, call yourself Carl Reiner. Those two things seem contradictory.
Well, they're not, because loving your father and looking up to your father doesn't necessarily mean you're feeling that back, that you're feeling that from him. And the scene in Stand By Me where the boys finally find the dead body and they're sitting there and Gordy starts to cry, and he's sitting there with River Phoenix, who plays Chris Chambers.
I never heard this Stand By Me breakdown, but this is interesting.
And he says, my father didn't love me. And
Share is an NPR podcast. It used to be a top podcast. He tells Terry Gross quite openly, he said, quote, I felt that my father didn't love me or understand me.
I felt that my father didn't, love me or understand me. And it was the character of Gordy that expressed those things. And the film was a combination of nostalgia, emotion, and a lot of humor. And it was a real reflection of my personality. It was an extension, really, of my sensibility. And when it became successful, I said, oh, okay, I can go in the direction that I want to go in and not feel like I have to, mirror everything my father has done up till then.
You just said you felt like your father didn't love or understand you when you were growing up, but you've also talked about how much you loved your father and wanted to be like him. You even wanted to take on his name at some point, call yourself Carl Reiner. Those two things seem contradictory.
Well, they're not, because loving your father and looking up to your father doesn't necessarily mean you're feeling that back, that you're feeling that from him. And the scene in Stand By Me where the boys finally find the dead body and they're sitting there and Gordy starts to cry, and he's sitting there with River Phoenix, who plays Chris Chambers, and he says, my father didn't love me. And
on a side note, Stand By Me has a great example of a dysfunctional family where there's more of a narcissistic father. And then Gordy is the lost child. He's literally the invisible child in that whole thing, kind of the scapegoat too. His older brother is the golden child who's into sports. And then the mother is kind of more of an enabler. But it's a great example of what you would consider a narcissistic family.
Chris says, no, he did love you. He just didn't know you. And that scene, I wrote that scene in a hotel room in Oregon, in Eugene, Oregon, when we were shooting up there. And as I was writing that scene, I start crying because that's the way I felt.
He talks about how he doesn't actually, this is amazing to me.
Okay.
Rob Reiner, he tells Terry Gross that the first time he ever felt validated from his father when he was 19 years old.
Wow.
He directed a theater. So he graduated from high school. He directed a theater version of Sartre's No Exit, which kudos to him for doing that at 19.
Yeah, impressive.
Sorry.
Rob's on his way.
Rob's directing Jean-Paul Sartre, the famous existentialist, his play No Exit at 19 in a local community theater. His father goes backstage. Here's what this is the validation he gets from his father. You ready for this? So yeah. Carl goes backstage. He does this production the first time. You know what his father says to him? What? He says, that was good.
And that was it.
That was good.
19 years later.
That was good. I mean, is that validation?
I mean, if you've been waiting for that for 19 years, it is. I mean, if his dad is a few words and doesn't validate him, that's got to feel pretty good.
And so Rob says of that moment, 19, first time he was ever validated, and he never felt loved or understood by his father. He says, quote, "That was the first time he said anything like that to me."
Wow.
Do you remember him telling you that? And was that an important affirmation for you?
You know, first of all, just hearing his voice it's got to me a little bit there. You know, I miss him, you know, and man, I still hear him, you know, all the time in my head. So to listen to that was pretty amazing. Anyway,
do you want a moment?
No, it's all right. It's all right. I mean, you know, he talked about the you know, the time I directed a No Exit, and that was.
So this aired December 16th, 2025. When did this happen? December 14th? Was it? But it also reminds me of the fact that they say any advice people give is really just them talking to younger versions of themselves. And maybe it sounds like that's what Rob was doing in the making of Stand By Me. Now, granted, a lot of that raw material was there from Stephen King, but Rob Reiner kind of filled in some of the gaps of the story.
The first time that he ever acknowledged that he thought I was, you know, I was good at what I was doing. He came backstage after the performance and he looked me in the eye and he said, "That was good. No bull." And that's the first time he ever said anything like that to me. And so I guess it wasn't until I was 19 that he validated that to me.
So in other words, Rob's father, Carl, more or less withheld love. And when he did praise him for the first time after 19 years, it was conditional. It was conditional on his performance,
His achievement.
of achievement of this play.
So now I approve of you. That was good. You did something.
You did something worthy of my attention and my praise. And here it is. That was good, right?
That was good.
Like, this, I presume, Rob Reiner.
So two things. So one, the conditional, what does that sound like? That sounds like narcissistic parents. Their love is conditional. You have to earn their love and affection, and love is used very liberally in this fashion, in quotations. So narcissistic parents make the kids earn it. If you do what you're supposed to do, you'll get rewarded with some validation or approval. If you don't, then love is withheld and you'll get punished, guilt-tripped, shamed, etc., or harshly criticized, or fill in the blank with another kind of punishment. Now, and Amy, in regards to this, what we do here is we just go over like several videos on the topic. But it's also an opportunity for the people in the chat, who I consider the flock of black sheep, to talk to each other and have something to do while watching me go over this stuff and get to know one another. So it's not just about the subject matter. It's about community. It's about me being able to give my inputs on other things that the topic at hand reminds me of. And that's what it's all about. I mean, usually I go not much longer than 3 hours usually.
Based on that comment, I presume that this is someone who's starved for love to some degree.
Yeah.
And it also raises questions about Rob Reiner's attachments. In other words, I don't know, like, and again, I want to make a distinction between kindness and loving, being loving, and connection.
Okay.
The question is, if you grow up with a father like Carl Reiner, who's very detached,
yeah,
and giving you no praise, and you say you don't feel loved or understood by him your entire childhood,
right?
Can you connect in a meaningful way to your children?
And it would be harder. I think he tried.
Yeah, no,
he would say, I want to be.
My answer is you can. You can. Just because your parents didn't connect with you doesn't make it impossible for you to connect with your kids. I know plenty of people that had a narcissistic parent or some other version of an abusive parent, and they do their very best to connect with their kids, and they're actually able to. Now, granted, some people might say, well, the prerequisite is you've done the work on yourself. Maybe. I don't even know if I would consider that a prerequisite. Connection doesn't always require people to have done the work. Sometimes it does. Maybe you could take the prerequisite of a healthy connection, maybe. But yeah, just because this guy seems to think that there's a lot of environmental stuff going on. Oh, if your parents didn't, it's going to be that much harder for you. He's talking about the mother's postpartum depression. It's like,
A better father
Right.
to them than my dad ever was to me.
Right.
The big part of it is how much he tried. But right, is it that easy? In other words, does it come that simply?
Right. Is it or is it even, if you grow up that way, is it even a skill that you can have? I mean, yes, you can cultivate it. Yes, you can work on it. Yes, you can go to therapy, and you can probably develop it, right? By doing the things we're doing right now.
Yeah.
You can probably,
And talk about it, as Rob did. Rob did talk about it.
you can learn it, you can talk about it, but like at some deeper level, at some unconscious level, I could argue, and I don't know if this is true, but many people, often because they're not reflecting on it, it seems like Rob reflected on it, but many people will reenact and repeat. Freud called it the repetition compulsion. They'll repeat that unresolved conflict over and over again throughout their lives in attempt to get that love.
So part of what people do say is, and there could be some truth in this, that people will reenact or they will try to get love from the parent they wanted the most amount of love from. So the parent that loved them the least, they'll seek out romantic partners that it's a way for them to heal that wound. So whatever wound they had from the parent, they try to heal it by getting someone who is like their parent to love them in a romantic way. I do see that play out a lot. I don't know if it's the only reason why it plays out. I think, sometimes it's just what is familiar. You had a narcissistic parent, so those baseline behaviors and energies are familiar. So you're going to be conditioned to associate those things with love. Yeah. And your parents, if your parent is a narcissist, that's the base trauma bond. I think that's true too. And also, you can't forget this part. Sometimes it's just attraction as well. I think attraction plays a part too. It's all of this, though. All of this combined is what influences people's choices.
That they never had. The repetition compulsion is an attempt to master a situation that we weren't able to master as children. And you can't master a situation that you're not in control of, because Carl Reiner held the cards, right? It was, in many ways, it was really cruel, in spite of the fact that Rob has said that he loved his father so much and he looked up to him and respected him and admired him. It's, in many ways, it's very cruel for a father or a parent or anybody to withhold, in that position of power, for someone to withhold love at that level and to make love so conditional upon performance. That's the type of thing.
So maybe in Rob, he was loved conditionally by his father, but Rob is someone that succeeded. He succeeded in life, made some good movies, was in some acting roles himself. So he succeeded, and I think he became even more popular than his father. So he's a version of someone that received conditional love, but he got the outward success. Nick Reiner, perhaps the opposite. Now, do you think Rob Reiner made Nick Reiner earn his love and affection? I don't know. I mean, if you hear the way Rob Reiner was talking, he seems to be very aware of that dynamic at play with him and his dad, which makes you think he wouldn't want to do that to his own son, right? That's what I would presume. But that being said, it's almost like Nick had a mindset closer to his grandfather's. But the difference is Nick wasn't like Rob. So he didn't have that skill set. So he wasn't able to succeed in the same way. And so when you can't succeed in the same way, but you have Carl Reiner's mindset, perhaps not a good combination.
That will really damage a child. And even though I'm sure Carl doesn't want to do that, right? Like you'd have to say Carl probably didn't get that from his father. And that's how you get the intergenerational cycle of, let's call it privation of emotion, right? This is how you get that cycle of shame.
Privation of emotion.
Well, lack of emotion. Right?
I liked privation.
Yeah,
that was I like that. It was interesting.
Yeah.
It's a good question, Kat. I'll put it on the screen here. Don't male narcs normally have a mother wound, though? What was Nick's relationship like with his mother? I think it's actually more of a myth that they all have a mother wound. Now, granted, some of them do. Absolutely, right? I'm not trying to dismiss it. But I don't think it's like what Sam Vaknin would say. He would say, oh, they're all just not individuating from their mother. No, I don't believe that. I think the genetic part is what proves that not to be true. If it was all just about the mother wound, then there would be no genetic part. Or maybe Sam Vaknin would say, well, you can have the genetic part, but then the mother wound activates it. And I would say, I don't agree with that either. And Dr. Salerno doesn't agree with that either. So I do think a lot of narcissistic guys turn their romantic partners into their mother. I think that does happen. And I do think I see dynamics where there's a narcissist with their narcissistic mother and they're enmeshed and there's that emotional incest going on. Yeah, that happens too. But it's just not a prerequisite for the narcissism. That's my opinion.
It was very descriptive.
So I've spent a lot of time on family culture. I think family culture is going to be a really key piece of the puzzle. Now you can see some of the elements. So we'll develop a lot of these ideas down the road, but that's a taste of how family culture fits this puzzle. So we've talked about a possible personality disorder. We've talked about mental illness, the importance of the family culture. We've talked about attachment.
Yeah, that's a possibility.
The other piece of this puzzle is addiction and substance abuse.
Exactly, which we know he suffered with. That seems to be the one certain.
So this video is at 54 minutes of 2 hours and 13 minutes. We're not going to watch the whole thing tonight. We'll go over a few more minutes of this and we'll wrap it up for the night.
Yeah. So by the time of his arrest, some estimates are upwards of 25 to 30 times in rehab. We know that by the time Nick was, by the time he filmed the movie in 2015, 16 of Being Charlie, he had been in rehab 18 times. 18 times.
Wow. That's
He's
incredible.
22 years old. So between the age of 15 and 22, we're talking 7 years.
18
times.
In and out.
Right. So clearly there's like a revolving door of, for these treatment facilities, and he's going to these treatment facilities all over the country and, clearly.
And some of that could to me just be they weren't getting it right. They weren't getting the diagnosis right. You don't get the diagnosis right, you're not treating the right thing. And maybe when someone doesn't stop using drugs, it just makes it that much harder to get the diagnosis right. Or choice C, he was just never willing to grow up, period. He never really wanted to stop. He never really wanted to grow up and take responsibility for himself. And regardless of what your parents do in that case, if that kid doesn't want to do better and he doesn't have the willingness, then nothing's going to change. And that's a bitter pill for a lot of parents to swallow, but it is true. The only thing parents can do in that case is enforce consequences.
Really, it's not working.
And we've seen some photos of him on some websites, rehab websites. They look amazing. They're going on hiking. They're mountaineering.
Yeah.
They're very high end. They look loving. They look encouraging. And he attended these.
Yeah. And so obviously addiction is going to be a big part of the story. Let's call it substance abuse. But the
Thinking about that too, going to rehab at 15, I just want to say that that's also intense. Like
Yeah.
I wasn't ready to leave home at 15. I wasn't, I mean, for me personally, a late bloomer, I don't know if I was ready to leave.
I went to rehab at 19. I didn't like it. And I left AMA against medical advice.
Leave home at 18, so think about leaving, it's almost similar, I guess, to like a boarding school experience or just kind of leaving, and that can't necessarily help connection either.
And not only that, I think at 15 it has a stigma, right? Like there's you're being branded as a drug addict and
Or a troublemaker.
A troublemaker, and you're 15 years old.
Yeah.
So substance abuse is another one of the key pieces of this puzzle. And then the final piece I think that is really, really, really important is what I would call aggressive and violent ideation. If you want to know, so you could have all these other pieces.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about the schizophrenia piece in a minute, but you can have let's say you have the schizophrenia piece, and there's a lot of research on schizophrenia, by the way, that does correlate schizophrenia with violence.
Mm-hmm.
So, although that's not clear cut, we'll get to that in a minute, but there is some association. There's some research that develops an association between schizophrenia and violence. But that's just such a small piece of that issue, in the sense that schizophrenia is not going to, in and of itself, isn't going to get you to murder, right? There have to be other pieces.
Yeah.
And I think one of the big pieces that we're going to need to talk about in some depth, we'll get to it a little bit today, is this idea of aggression and violence and violent ideation, which is, we know from, I just talked about the Alana Zabel story about him throwing a vase across the room. We know from other accounts of Nick that he could be aggressive apparently in childhood. We know this story. Most people have heard the story about him tearing up the guest house.
Yeah.
Him going on this impulsive rampage where he literally destroyed the entire guest house. He tells the story on the Dopey podcast back in 2015. The host of the Dopey podcast, by the way, is Dave Mannheim. And so he did a series of interviews with Dave Mannheim over the years. And, he recounts some of these stories. So
like
neighbors have talked about, neighbors and old friends have talked about him being aggressive. So you have this potential, you have this potential piece here that I think a lot of people really aren't paying attention to. And that is that there does seem to be some aggression.
Yes.
There does seem to be some oppositionality
and this is the important part, where most mental illnesses, and if you want to consider the personality disorders mental illnesses, we'll say that for sake of argument, outside of like psychopathy and some narcissism, the rest of them are not like inherently abusive or anything for the very most part. So, but like with anything that's going on, any mental illness, any mood disorder, any addiction, they can also be comorbid with something else. They could be comorbid with narcissism or antisocial personality disorder, right? And those are the things that'll create violence. Those things that have a lack of empathy, that's the problem. And as far as I know, most schizophrenic people, that's not going to be the case for them. Even with the cluster A versions, I don't think that's going to be the case with them for the very most part. I think it's more likely if they do become violent, there's a comorbidity with something else.
You have, and here's Here's another example. In the movie Being Charlie, the story opens with him in this rehab facility, and he wants to leave. So he's leaving, and on his way out of the facility, there's a little part of this facility that has this beautiful stained glass window, and it's connected to. It looks like it's connected to a church in a part of the rehab facility. So Charlie exits the building, and he's leaving, and he takes this big rock, and he throws it through the window. It turns out, so let's think about that behavior in and of itself, though. You're knowingly and willfully destroying a window on a church.
A church, nonetheless.
A church, which is highly symbolic, obviously.
Of peace, love.
And so we went over this part before here too. But anyway, I think we should stop it there because that's right at the 1 hour mark. If there's interest, we can watch the other hour and 13 minutes another day. But that seems to be a good baseline there, a place to stop at. And to reiterate, though, too, so cluster Bs like narcissism, borderline, antisocial personality disorder, they're the most likely to be abusive, right? But even then, that does not always include physical violence. It doesn't always. It can, for sure, but not always. That's another thing that can be tricky. There's many versions of violence. Sexual violence, emotional violence, physical violence. Thank you, Kat. Did I stay sober after? No, I did not. After my first rehab, I dicked around for a few more years before the pain got great enough and I finally decided to do better. But my voice is failing me now. I feel like my brain's still hazy and my voice is failing me. And they would have gotten away with it if not for those pesky cluster Bs, Kat. Well, for many people it does, Kat. So people might get clean from alcohol or drugs and they switch to gambling or they switch to sex or they switch to shopping or they switch to porn. You see that a lot in 12-step programs. And I think you see that with everybody, honestly. You see that with humans in general. Show me the human that doesn't use something to get outside of themselves. Show me the human. Show me the human. I don't think you'll be able to. I think the only variables are what people use and how frequently they use it. Even if it's caffeine. Like people are always doing something. Thank you, Heather. Thanks, Anne. Thank you, Ellie. Thank you, Songbits. I'm not interested in what HTC has to I will say, Lauren, that's her name. She doesn't look too thrilled with that person. Not at all. Not at all. And what about Kratom, Rose City? Give me something to feel good. John just has a slow, drawn out way of talking. But, I'm glad that he brought up the character disorder, personality disordered stuff for sure. Oh, good. I think kratom to me is a very natural thing. And it's from Indonesia. And to me, it's much better than being on a benzo or some other prescription opioid or something. So I have no problems with it. I'm all for whatever works for people, Rose. That's what I'll say. And so I don't have a problem with that at all. But all right, everybody. I'm going to rock and roll here and get my rest. Thanks everyone who's in the chat. Thanks for the super chats. And I'll be back again tomorrow night. I'm glad it did, Mindy. That's a common story for a lot of people. Yeah, it's probably more of a placebo in that case, Kat. But If it helps, it helps. Have a good night, Britt. I mean, Kratom's helped me. So I'm pro Kratom. But anyway, over and out, everyone. Check out some rest of the videos on the channel. Make sure you like the video on your way out, and make sure you're subscribed to the channel if you're not already.